Truth in My Days podcast is sponsored by the Truth in My Days ministry. Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hi, I'm Dana Torres, and welcome to another episode of the Truth in My Days radio program. Today, I'm here with John Torres and Jason Chan as they discuss the important topic of creation and evolution.
Oh, Jason, could you tell us a little about yourself, your academic background?
Yes. Hello, everyone. So I graduated with a Bachelor's of Engineering at the University of Alberta, specifically mechanical engineering. I'm currently pursuing a Master's in mechanical engineering.
So would you say you're well-versed in science?
Yes, hopefully I would say so. There's still a lot that I need to learn, but I would say that I do have a lot of background in science.
Okay, that's good, because creation evolution obviously deals with both what the Bible has to say and what science has to say and which should rule. So since you have this expertise in science, would you say that you'd be able to call me out if I'm saying something that's not correct from a scientific point of view?
Hopefully, yes.
All right, then, let's get started. And first, let's surface why this is such an important issue. Let me ask you, what would you think about this? What percentage of professing Christian young people fall away from their faith within the first 6 months of their entering university? Would you guess, 3%, 7%, 12%? What would you think?
Well, out of those three numbers, I'd say 12%, but I have an inkling that it's a little bit higher than that.
It's actually a bit higher. According to Creation Ministries International, the answer is 70%. And I've seen from other ministries that put it as high as 90%. And it's perhaps not difficult to see why if they go into university unprepared for this issue. Because they're going here now, they're going to study for their careers, they're paying good money to study. So they expect that what they're going to hear is both true and important for them. They will face the professor, and the professor has a lot of cachet to them. He's got academic degrees. And the idea then that people absorb is he must be right. And if he's saying something that disagrees with me, then probably he's right and I'm wrong. And unfortunately, most of the professors will actually promote evolution. Richard Dawkins, in a book review written back in 1989, wrote this: "It is absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked. But I'd rather not consider that." And that, unfortunately, will be the attitude of many of the professors around you. And not just your professors. You're going to be in what may be very large lecture halls surrounded by a lot of other people. And those people will be watching with rapt attention and accepting whatever the professor has to say. And if it contradicts your Christian beliefs, you're going to start feeling very vulnerable and perhaps very isolated. And there will be pressure on you to just go along with what you're hearing. And I've heard of these classes where a professor actually starts on the very first day, the very first thing he says, "Is there anyone in this class who believes in creation?" And if you put your hand up, he'll say, "Get out of this class, drop the course, I don't want you here." That kind of thing does happen. And it's not just in the schools. You see everywhere, in the magazines, on TV, in the journals, everywhere, claims about Darwinism, about evolution, that presume it's just absolutely true. You'll see cover articles in Nature, which is one of the two leading journals, scientific journals in the world. You will see it in philosophy magazines like Philosophy Now, news magazines like The Spectator, history magazines. Darwin versus God, exploding the myth of the clash between church and science, is an issue they brought out for the bicentennial of Darwin's birth. Of course, the atheist magazines like The Humanist, and even children's magazines. Yes Mag in the same year published an issue with a cover article called "Happy Birthday, Darwin." Did you encounter any of this in your time in the university, Jason?
Well, I never encountered where the professor would ask if anyone believed in creationism, but growing up, I was actually not a Christian. So In school, in public school, I learned about evolution. I never really questioned it. Everybody I knew also believed in evolution. And so this will be quite interesting to hear your thoughts about evolution, John, and what the Bible supports and so on.
All right. Well, let's hope we live up to your expectations then. So this is portrayed as a debate between science and faith, science and religion, science and Christianity. And science has great cachet. Everybody knows science is true. Science is an objective search for the truth done through the scientific method. And so its conclusions are correct. They're solid. They really can't be controverted. And so if the Bible disagrees, the Bible has to be wrong. Interestingly, the Bible warned about this very thing way back in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 20 to 21. We read this from the old King James Version. O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science falsely so called, which some professing have erred concerning the faith. Now, some will point out that's an old translation of the word gnosis, the Greek word, which actually means knowledge. It's not science specifically, but certainly science does fall under that purview of gnosis. So it is actually telling us that what we're seeing now is going to happen. Some will err concerning the faith because of science falsely so called. So let's begin looking at the issue in detail. And remember that according to 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 5 to 11, the way to avoid falling here is to not just sit on your faith, but add to your faith virtue, to virtue knowledge, to knowledge perseverance, and so on. Add knowledge. It's important to know these things, and that's why we're going to go over it. So let's begin with this. What is the most fundamental fact for any person? What's the most fundamental fact for you, Jason?
That I'm here. I'm a living, breathing human person, and I know I exist.
Yeah, this is absolutely the most fundamental fact for anybody, is that we exist, where we're here, because if we're not here, there are no other questions for us. We must first be before we can ask questions. But that then, the fact that we're here raises naturally two other questions. Question number one, why am I here? Or where did I come from? And then where am I going, or what is my purpose? These are the two questions that follow on from that. Now, there are only two possible answers to the first one. Why am I here? Two possible answers. What do you think those would be?
For the first one, or where did I come from? It could either be that I was created by something with intention, or I came to be from a random chance.
All right, let's be very precise and very logical about this. We'll go by what's called the law of excluded middle in logic. It's one of the three axioms of logic, something so certain nobody even needs to prove it. And the law of the excluded middle says that a proposition and its negation cover all possibilities. In other words, we were either created or we were not created. Those are the only two possibilities because they cover everything. If you're created, you're in the first category. Anything else goes into the second category. And these would have ramifications to it, of course, because if you're created by the God of the Bible, for example, then there is a supreme being who dictates right and wrong to you, and you are answerable to him. On the other hand, if we were not created, then we can do whatever we want to, and we can get away with it because it makes man the measure of all things. For the second question, then we have purpose, though. That first thing might sound good to some people, to be completely independent, not have to answer to anybody for anything, do whatever you want. But on the flip side, when we look at the second question, the purpose, if we're created by the God of the Bible, we have a purpose, and that is to know him, worship him, glorify him, serve him, enjoy him forever with a destiny of eternal life in a perfect place. But on the flip side, if we're not created, well, then we have no real purpose. We have no real meaning. Our only destiny is to head into oblivion, into nothingness, and that's the end of us. So, the two possibilities, created by someone, not created by someone. Well, what are the possibilities?
Well, some believe that we were created by some crazy scientists, that we were living in a simulation.
Yeah, or what other possibilities?
Some alien outside of our dimension.
Yeah, you will actually sometimes hear that, and scientists will even put that seriously, that life on Earth was seeded from outer space by some other civilization. But these don't really answer the question. They only move it back one level, because if I was created by mad scientists, the question becomes, well, who created the mad scientist? Well, maybe he was created by a space alien, but then we ask who created the space alien? And we'll end up with this regress. And we can't have an infinite regress. Somewhere at the beginning, there has to be something to start creation that did not itself have to be created. Now, let's look at the creation account in Genesis. I think most of you are familiar with it. It's in Genesis chapter 1, which gives an overview where God created the world in 6 days. It begins in verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then he shapes and forms things, light, dry land, seas, and so on. And then stars, the sun, the moon. And then it gets to the point where he creates again, he creates life force. And we have living creatures in the world. And then finally on day 6, he creates man in his own image. And then Genesis chapter 2 will go into more detail about the creation of man specifically. It's summed up in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them. So that's the creation version. If we have to define creationism, we'll define it this way. It's the belief that the world and the life in it originated through the act of a supernatural being. Now understand, creationism doesn't prove the God of the Bible. It does prove there's a God. And then we move on to the next question of which God. And since there's only one who authenticated his messenger through fulfilled ancient prophecies, miracles, and the resurrection from the dead, we know which God. It is the God of the Bible. So biblical creationism, then, is the belief that the world and the life in it originated through the willful act of the God of the Bible, as described primarily in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, in 6 earth rotation days, 24-hour days. They could have been slightly shorter then. And approximately 6,000 years ago, and certainly a maximum of 7,686 years ago, this is also known as young earth creationism. So on the other side, the competitor then we have is the theory of evolution, generally ascribed to Charles Darwin when he published his book, The Origin of Species, in 1859. To sum up the theory of evolution, well, it's a little more difficult, because if you ask scientists what is evolution, you will get probably about 6 different definitions, whatever fits the argument at the time. But generally it's descent with modification, or change in gene frequency, which really isn't evolution. And the main picture, though, is you have living organisms that through the generations change slowly from one form into another over time. The theory of evolution, Darwinism, or technically neo-Darwinism, the one that people hold to today, says that the world and the life in it originated through undirected, which means random, natural processes. They were unguided by any intelligence. The universe formed slowly, starting about 13.6 billion years ago. The Earth formed slowly, beginning about 4.6 billion years ago. And sometime after that, life arose on Earth through the spontaneous self-organization of simple, non-living chemicals into a cell, which then somehow came to life. And then through billions of years, these cells developed generation after generation into complex multicellular organisms until we have all of the forms of life that we see on Earth today. The driving force, the thing that makes this happen, is what's called survival of the fittest, or natural selection, acting on random genetic mutations. In other words, you have an organism and the genes that dictate what the organism is like get changed somehow by some kind of random chance, either as they recombine during reproduction or possibly by radiation, mutating them, they change. And if the change gives a benefit to survival, it will do better than the ones that didn't have that change, and they will survive and thrive. And that's how you get new organisms. So overall, there's this picture that once upon a time, way back when on Earth, you had water, some little warm pool. And in the warm pool, you had simple chemicals, water, H2O, carbon monoxide, CO, carbon dioxide, CO2, hydrogen gas, nitrogen gas. And then they join together to give you more complex chemicals, amino acids, glucose, nucleotides. Where did this come from? How did this happen? Well, they suggest maybe you got energy from volcanic eruptions or from lightning, and that drove this to happen. And so as time went by, you had these simple chemicals joining together until you had RNA, ribonucleic acid, and that could reproduce. Meanwhile, in another chain, you had lipids, fatty molecules, self-assembling, and proteins. And eventually, these all joined together into a very complex structure that's a protocell. And then the key point, this cell came to life. It passed from non-living to living. And then after that, this cell became multicellular organisms. Single cells joined together with other cells to become more and more complex. And then the different cells picked up different tasks to do. They specialized until, as we say, we go all the way from the simple cell through sponges and corals and up through fishes and then amphibians and reptiles, mammals and birds, and all the way up to man. And that's then the version that they have. If you look specifically at man, his family tree, we're told there was some kind of a very, very primitive ancestor, some insectivore that looked sort of like a shrew. And then it went through different forms through millions of years, gave side chains leading to things like lemurs and baboons and gorillas. But one chain ended up as human beings. So that's where we are now. And scientists tell us that it's not over yet. We're still continuing to change. So that's a theory of evolution. As I said, the driving force is this natural selection or survival of the fittest, acting on random variation. That's how Darwin put it. He didn't know about genetics, but he did notice that if you look at the birds, these finches on the Galapagos Islands, he noticed that they had different sized beaks. The finches on different parts of the island had different sized beaks. One type of finch had these very big, solid, strong beaks, and they ate nuts. So they used these strong beaks to crack the nuts and eat the inside. One type had very thin bills that they used to poke into the trees and get the insects and eat that way. And Darwin believed that these different traits developed to fit the environment in which they lived. And because different birds had different bills, he ran with that and thought that, yes, a single cell could eventually turn into a gorilla. Now, he had no explanation for where the variation came from, but eventually the theory of evolution was combined with genetics. And so the variation came, as we said, from random genetic mutation, and that's called neo-Darwinism. Now, that's a very, very, very different picture from what we see in the Bible, where God created animals according to their own kinds, immediately, fully formed. Now, by kinds, we don't know exactly what. There must have been some original cat kind. And yes, from the cat kind, you could get lions, tigers, leopards, jaguars, snow leopards, cougars, lynxes, bobcats, servals, caracals, domestic cats, and so on. You'd have had an original dog kind from which we could get wolves, foxes, jackals, collies, German shepherds, and so on. But this is a downward progress where you have fully formed animals then giving rise to subsets, as opposed to the evolution, which goes the other way around. You start with the very simple things and they give rise to new complex types. So prima facie, these certainly do seem to be at odds with each other. You cannot have both.
I see. Thanks for all of that explanation, John. Going back to the definition of biblical creationism, You said that the world was created in 6 24-hour days. I've heard before that the Hebrew term for days is yom, and I've heard that it can mean more than just a 24-hour period. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, the word for a day is yom, and yes, it can have different meanings. In fact, most nouns in most languages can have more than one meaning. The English word set, for example, actually, if you include verbs, has over 400 different specific meanings. But what you want to do is find from the context which it is. Now, certainly there are Christians who say you can combine the two. Faced with the claims of science, faced with the assumption that science cannot be wrong, that it is an objective search for truth, and that science has certainly discovered that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. They've come to believe that. Then you have an issue if you want to hold on to the Bible as well. You have to try to make them fit together. Now, do understand, when they try to make them fit together, they never try to bend the claims of science to fit the Bible. It's always the other way around. They try to change the Bible to fit the claims of science, or what they think is science. In this case, one of the most common ways they do that is to look at this word yom and say, you know what? Yom can mean different things, so it may not actually be a 24-hour day in the creation account. Perhaps it's a long, long period of time. Well, is that possible? As I said, every language has many nouns that do that, maybe most of them. Set has so many different ones, and they're quite different one from another. If we look at the English word set, it could mean a group of things of the same kind that belong together and are so used. For example, a chess set. It could mean the number of couples required for participation in a square dance, which is very different. It could mean the scenery constructed for a theatrical performance, or the entire enclosure in which a movie is filmed. In music, it can mean a session of music played before an intermission. In mathematics, it's a collection of distinct elements having specific common properties, a set of positive integers, for example. In sports, a group of games constituting one division or unit of a match, like in tennis. But here's the thing, context always tells you what it is. If I say, for example, Tors beat Novak Djokovic in Wimbledon 3-0, you're not going to wonder which out of those 400 different meanings of set am I using. You know that this is the group of games constituting one division or unit of a match. If the director shouts quiet on the set, you don't think he's talking about a chess set. Context always tells you. Now, in the case of this word yom, creationists will point out that there are indicators in the context that tell you which of the different meanings to take. Now, there aren't that many different meanings for yom, but they will point out where yom occurs in the Bible. How is it used? In Genesis 1, yom is ordinally numbered. What it means is you have the second day, the third day, the fourth day, the fifth day. They're ordinally numbered. And they will point out that elsewhere in the Bible, yom is ordinally numbered 359 times, and every time it refers to 24-hour day. So they say, why should we make an exception in Genesis 1? They will point out even more significantly that yom in Genesis 1 is demarcated by evening and morning. Now, not only does that occur elsewhere in the Bible 38 times and always refers to 24-hour day, it's obvious that evening and morning is a division of days, 24-hour days. It's not a division of years. It's not a division of eons or eras. They say that yom is distinguished by light and darkness because Genesis 1 talks about there's the period of light, which God called day, and the period of darkness God called night. So one yom, a 24-hour day, is made up of the yom, which is the light period, and as well there's the dark period. And they'll point out, well, how do you fit that into trying to reconcile that? Do we say we have like 1 billion years of light and then 1 billion years of darkness and then 1 billion years of light? It just doesn't work. They will point out that Exodus 20:11, which we mentioned before, puts it in the plural. For in 6 days, and in part it's yamim, in 6 days, 6 yamim, the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them. And yom appears in the plural form, yamim, 845 times elsewhere in the Bible. It's always a 24-hour day. So they would say, if we're honestly trying to figure out what it said here, then we should go with 24-hour day. Now, another point they'll make out is yom has different meanings, yes, but an indefinite, a vast length of time is not one of those attested meanings. If you check the standard, industry standard lexicons like Brown Driver Briggs, you will not find that as one of the meanings of yom. It may refer to something other than a 24-hour day, but not an indefinite, long period of time. But here's what should drive it home. And this is what they do not often bring up, even the ones defending the biblical view, is that yom has different meanings, yes. But yom, when it's not in construct and when it has no affixes, can only mean 24 hours. It has no other meanings. Okay, now, what do we mean by that? They will point to things like the day of the Lord, the day of wrath. And they'll say, look, that's not necessarily a 24-hour day. And that may be correct. Maybe a 24-hour day, may not be. We don't know for sure. But here in the Hebrew, the noun is in construct. What do we mean by that? In English, if you say day of the Lord, you use this little prepositional phrase, use the preposition of, okay, day of the Lord. And that's how we know it's day of the Lord. In Hebrew, they don't do that. They actually stick the two nouns together. Okay? So day of the Lord, day is yom. The Lord is God's personal name, Yehovah. They don't say day of Yehovah. They just say day Yehovah, Yom Yehovah. And then the first noun there is said to be in construct, and the second noun is absolute. So anytime you have something like day of the Lord, day of wrath, day of judgment, day of anger, it may not be a 24-hour day, but always there, day, Yom, is in construct. Now, sometimes I'll point to things like in the day of King Hezekiah, for example, and say, oh, look, that's just a 24-hour day. And that's true, it's not. But here, okay, how do we say in the day? Okay, here they do use a preposition, but it's what they call an inseparable preposition. The Hebrew preposition for in is ba, and you stick it right onto the noun. So if you want to say in the day, you say bayom. Okay, that affix is stuck right onto it. So every time in the Bible you see something like in the day of anger, in the day, you see bayom, bayom, bayom. It always has that affix. So here's the point. Yom can have different meanings if it has the affix or if it's in construct state. But if one of those two has to be at least one of those two, and if it's not there, it can only mean a 24-hour day, a regular Earth rotation day. And guess what? In Genesis 1, Yom is not in construct and it has no affix. So it means a 24-hour day or the daylight part of a 24-hour day. Those are the only possibilities. So you will hear people who are trying to fit the two together saying that, well, it could mean that. But if you know Hebrew and you read it, you'll know it can't mean that, actually. And the Hebrew experts, the ones that don't have an axe to grind on this, are very clear that this is what it means. Now, it's important to note this because you will have Christians who try to combine the two, trot out some Hebrew expert who will say you can mix the two together, but you really can't. Okay, you really can't. And if you look at the experts in Hebrew who don't have an axe to grind, who don't have a dog in the fight, who are not trying to fit the two together, will tell you flat out that no, you cannot have Yom in Genesis 1 mean something other than a 24-hour day or the daylight part of it. For example, the Oxford Hebrew scholar, Professor James Barr, who was a Christian but something of a liberal Christian, writing about Genesis, the meaning of it, he writes, probably, so far as I know, there is no professor of Hebrew or Old Testament at any world-class university who does not believe that the writer of Genesis 1 to 11 intended to convey to their readers the idea that, one, creation took place in a series of 6 days which were the same as the days of 24 hours we now experience, to the figures contained in the genealogies provided by simple addition, a chronology from the beginning of the world up to later stages in the biblical story. 3, Noah's flood was understood to be worldwide and extinguish all human and animal life except for those in the ark. Another example, Dr. Bolton David Heiser tells us about a friend of his, a Dr. John R. Hewitt, who wrote to the appropriate professors in 9 leading universities. And he asked them this question: do you consider that the Hebrew word yom, as used in Genesis 1, accompanied by a numeral, should properly be translated as a day as commonly understood, or as an age, or as either a day or an age without preference? Now, he wrote to 9 leading universities. He didn't get an answer back from Oxford or Cambridge, but he did from the professors at Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Toronto, London, McGill, and Manitoba. And they all answered unanimously that it should be translated as a day as commonly understood. Professor Pfeiffer of Harvard added of 24 hours, just to be very clear. Hugh Williamson, the current, at the time, Regius Professor of Hebrew at Oxford University. He's one of the top 10 Hebraists anywhere in the world. In an email, he said, so far as the days of Genesis 1 are concerned, I'm sure that Professor Barr was correct. I have not met any Hebrew professors who had the slightest doubt about this, unless they were already committed to some alternative by other considerations that do not arise from a straightforward reading of the Hebrew text as it stands. Now, what's that other consideration? They believe that science has shown the earth is 4.6 billion years old. They want to hold on to the Bible. They want to mix the two, and so they have to say that day can mean something else. Professor Emmanuel Tove of Hebrew University in Jerusalem, definitely a Hebrew expert, he said, look, for the biblical people, this was history, difficult as it is for us to accept this view. And this is from a fellow who actually teaches and thinks in Hebrew. Now, what else? There's a residential theological research library, Tyndale House, outside of Cambridge University in England. Now, there's a warden there, the current warden, apparently a very knowledgeable man named Peter Williams. And he wrote this: although the young universe creationist position is not widely held within secular academia, the position that the author of Genesis 1 maintained that the world was created in 6 literal days is nearly universally held. So that's the reality, and there's no point in denying it. It's almost not honest to argue that it means something else. The experts will tell you that it doesn't mean anything else. It cannot mean anything else. It is 6 Earth rotation or 24-hour days. And if we think science says something different, well, that's what we have to deal with.
I see. Thanks for all of that explanation, John. Moving on to the second part of the definition of biblical creationism, then, you mentioned that the age of the earth is 6,000 years old. How did we come to that number?
Well, 6,000 approximately, as I said, a maximum of 7,686. How we come to it is from data given to us in the Bible itself, which is inspired. God breathed as much as anything else in the Bible. If Genesis 1 tells us that God created the world in 6 Earth rotation days, Adam was created on day 6. So we know that the Earth is 5 days plus whatever we have from Adam moving forward. Now, if you look in Genesis 5, it will give you the number of years from Adam to Noah's birth, because it gives us what's called a chronogenealogy there. It's not just a genealogy. It doesn't just say that Adam begot Seth, Seth begot Enosh, Enosh begot Cainan, and so on. It tells us how old each person was when he begot the next person. So the idea of saying, well, maybe there are gaps in the genealogies and maybe it's a much longer time, it doesn't work here. Because if we have this many years between Adam and Seth, it doesn't matter if Seth is the son or the grandson or the great-grandson, we still know how many years from Adam's birth to Seth's birth. So these numbers are absolute. It really doesn't help the old agers anyway, though, because they need lots of years before Adam, not after. So these are chronogenealogies. They give the age between each two successive name, the number of years between each two successive name in the list. We can add those together. That will come to 1,056 years up to Noah's birth. In Genesis 6 and 7, we know how old Noah was at the start of the flood, 600 years old. Then we know he was on the ark for a year in the flood. And then coming off of that, in Genesis 11, we have more of these chronogenealogies. Arphaxad, we're told, was born 2 years after the flood. And then we can add up the chronogenealogies there because they go all the way to Abraham. And we have 220 years to the birth of Abraham. Then, according to Genesis 21:5, from Abraham is 100 years old when Isaac is born. So we add another 100 years. Then another 60 years to the birth of Jacob, according to Genesis 25:26. There's 130 years between the birth of Jacob and the time when Jacob's family moves down to Egypt. They're there for this 130 years there, Genesis 47:28. And then from that time to the Exodus is 430 years. Okay? We're told that in Exodus 12:40 to 41. And it's confirmed actually because in 1 Kings 6:1, we're told that the time from the Exodus to the year that Solomon dedicated the temple was 480 years. Now, once we're into Solomon's reign, we have the kings, and we're given detailed information about how long each king reigned and then succeeded. And that traces us all the way to the captivity in Babylon. We add up all of these numbers and we come up with 3,459 years from creation to the captivity in Babylon. And that's an historically established fact. It happened in 586 BC. You might want to play with that, but you can't play with it more than a few years one way or the other. So you take the 3,459, you add the 586 up to AD 1, and now we're in the year 2021, so you add another 2,021 years. And then you've got the age of the earth. This is not absolutely certain because there are uncertainties in it. Like a certain man was 130 years old and got a son. Well, was that 130 years in one day, or was it 130 years in 300 days? Exactly which textual traditions are you using for the numbers? So there are certain uncertainties, and that's why we can say approximately 6,000. But when you add in all of the uncertainties, maximum possible value for these, the earth is a maximum of 7,686 years old. This year, next year it'll be 7,687. Mm-hmm. There's an excellent article written up by Chris Hardy and Dr. Robert Carter on this. You can find it on the internet. It's called the Biblical Minimum and Maximum Ages for the Earth. Now, so that's definitely what the Bible teaches. And some people say, but it's not important. Why fight about it? If I want to believe in a 4.6 billion year old earth, what difference does it make? It's not a salvific belief. I don't have to believe in a young earth to be saved. And I certainly agree with that. You do not have to believe in a young earth to be saved. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't believe what the Bible says. And it's not an important thing to make an issue of. And it is for two reasons. One, however we might want to slice and dice it, we know what the Bible says. We know it says 6 days, and that's clear to everybody. So when you have to start arguing that, well, but maybe the Bible doesn't really mean what it says, you're attacking the credibility of the Bible. Yeah, you're not wanting to do that, but you are doing that. And you may say, well, I can live with that. I can live with this kind of cognitive dissonance in my mind, but there are other people who can't. The other people will say, look, you don't believe what the Bible says. Why should I? And if the Bible's wrong on creation, why should I believe it on salvation? And for that, they would go to Jesus himself. When John 3:12 said, if I've told you about earthly things and you do not believe, how will you believe when I tell you heavenly things? If we can't trust the Bible on things we can check, like the age of the earth, why would we trust it on anything else? So that's one reason. But there's a second reason why this is an important issue. And that is that in the New Testament, Adam is presented as a type in reverse, an antitype, so to speak, of Christ. We see Paul waxing eloquent on this in Romans chapter 5, and it'll come up again in 1 Corinthians. But he says, look, as by one man sin entered the world, and death by sin, and so death passed to all men because all have sinned. Even so, through the offense of one, many die. By the grace of one man, Jesus Christ, grace has come. For by one man's offense, death, that's Adam, life by one, Jesus Christ. As by the offense of one, judgment came, by the righteousness of one, the free gift came. For as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so by the obedience of one shall many be made righteous. So it is drawing this exact parallel and opposite of what Adam did and what Jesus did. Adam brought sin into the world, Jesus defeats it. Adam brought in death, Jesus brings in life. Just as in Adam, even so in Christ. Well, we've got a problem then, because if we're going to meld the Bible with old ages, what happens? Well, either Adam disappears, okay, because you're going to have some kind of ape men evolving into people. And if that happens, what happens to this parallel? As in Adam, even so in Christ. Well, if the as in Adam is fake, what happens to the even so in Christ? And even if you don't, even if you say, look, the world was around for 4.6 billion years, and then 6,000 years ago, God made Adam de novo, you could do that. But the problem is you have billions of years of death and destruction in the world. And the Bible says death came in as a result of sin. For the Bible, when God made the world, he looked at it, he called it good. And he said, very good. And we see in Genesis 1, he said he made the plants for food. And he said, this is food for people, and it's food for the animals. The idea of carnivory, the idea of death, animals attacking each other, killing each other, was not in the original creation. That was what God called good. Now, if you're not going to accept the age of the biblical age of the earth, you're going to bring death in before Adam, which means death didn't enter the world as a result of sin. It would have to mean that God wanted death in there all along. And if that's the case, what are we being rescued from? What are we being restored to? We're being restored to an original condition of, what was it? Death, right? Do you not see that as a problem? 1 Corinthians 15, 21 to 22, for since by man came death, by man came also the resurrection from the dead. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ all shall be made alive. So what happens to this if there's no Adam? If we have a 4.6 billion years old earth, if we have people coming out of insectivore ancestors, what happens to the gospel message?
And it's all for nothing, basically.
Does that seem like a proper understanding of what the Bible says on this, or am I missing something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not at all.
Yeah. So you see, this is why a lot of Christians, unfortunately, think this is not an important issue. It really is. And this is why so many young people have fallen away. It's not the only issue, for sure. There are others, but this is one of them. Yeah, this is one of them because they come and say, the professors will come and say, look, the Bible's wrong. Yeah? The earth is not 7,686 years old. It was not made by God in 625 days. And young people say, but the Bible says so. And then they go back to their pastors and pastors, oh, no. You know, science is right. Maybe the date doesn't really mean that. But you're looking at the Bible, you know it means that. But you're being told, and then you're wondering, look, these pastors, these scholars are more educated than I am, and they're not believing what the Bible says here. Why would I believe it? So do we see that this is an important issue?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that is why some of us do make an issue of it. So now comes the $24,000 question. Which one is right? Creation or evolution? Biblically speaking, God made the earth maximum 7,686 years ago, 6 24-hour days. And that should settle it. The Christian, that should settle it. And he might not know the science. And if he doesn't, and he says, look, I don't know the science, but I know what the Bible says and I believe it because it's the word of God, I can respect that perfectly. At the same time, it's good to look at the science side of it, because if the Bible's right, true science should agree with it, and it will be very helpful in breaking down challenges against the Bible. So let's move on to the science side of it. Okay, we've looked at the Bible, but now we're going to look simply from the point of view of science and see, does science really stand against the Bible, or does it agree with the Bible? Is it really just unwarranted assumptions and indirect assertions brought in by atheist scientists that make science look like it disagrees? That's what we're going to look at next. Okay, so now we've reached the big question, which is right, creation or evolution? So let's start looking at where the theory of evolution came from. Who came up with the theory of evolution?
To my understanding, it was Charles Darwin.
Yeah, everybody will give credit to Charles Darwin. He certainly wrote that very influential book, The Origin of Species, in 1859, which really did push the thinking of society over into the direction of accepting the theory of evolution. But he was actually not the one who came up with the theory. It has been taught many times. The earliest that we have, first known person to teach the theory of evolution was a fellow called Anaximander of Miletus, way back in 520 BC. Anaximander was an atheist, and so he had to believe that, look, there's life here. It had to have come from somewhere. I don't believe in a God, so it had to have come by natural processes. So he anticipated Darwin by 2,300, 2,400 years. Now, as Christianity came to dominate, these kind of theories pretty much disappeared. But things began to change in the Enlightenment era. This was a period that began in the 17th century. Western Europe was becoming richer, making scientific advancements. Life was becoming more comfortable and easier. And so it began by this Enlightenment period. The roots actually went before the 17th century, but it really took off in the 17th century and then was fully realized in the 18th century when we had the Industrial Revolution. This is the point where people, and this shouldn't surprise us if we know the Bible, people decided to get rid of God. They saw reason and rationality as the ultimate means to attain truth. All truth is accessible to the human mind. He is the measure of all things. He figures everything out. And naturally, then, this was characterized by a full-blown assault on God and his revelation. Psalm 14:1 says, the fool has said in his heart, there's no God. Romans 1:18 and 28 speaks of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness and says they did not like to retain God in their knowledge. They didn't like it. So this was an era where you had the intellectuals, the intelligentsia, the philosophers, the philosophers, and so on, the opinion makers really pushing to get rid of God. It was not something that really trickled down to the masses initially, but it was being pushed by the intellectuals. Here's a comment from Professor Edward J. Larson, then of the University of Georgia. Larson is probably the world's leading expert in the history of the theory of evolution. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author on the topic. And in his lecture series called The Theory of Evolution, A History of Controversy, he says this: during the Enlightenment, during, say, the 1700s, notions of evolution began creeping back in. That is, creation by natural law. If a people are intent in pushing out God or rejecting divine causation, really, the only alternative is where species, well, they could be eternal, as Aristotle said, or they had to come from other species. Where else could they come from? Now, I find this very interesting because here's this world-leading expert on the history of the theory of evolution admitting that the real driving force for accepting evolution and rejecting creation was not science. It was the people intent in pushing out God. That was always what was behind the theory of evolution. It was never about actual science. Science became a pretext after the fact. Richard Dawkins, in his famous book, The Blind Watchmaker, writes this: an atheist before Darwin could have said, following Hume, I have no explanation for complex biological design. All I know is that God isn't a good explanation. So we must wait and hope that somebody comes up with a better one, unquote. I can't help feeling that such a position, though logically sound, would have left one feeling pretty unsatisfied, and that although atheism might have been logically tenable before Darwin, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. That's what Dawkins tells us. And here again, you see evolution was there for a purpose. It was to buttress atheism. If I'm an atheist, I have no good explanation for the world, where it came from, where life came from. All I can say is, well, God isn't a good explanation. Now, I don't explain why God isn't a good explanation, because in fact, God is a perfect explanation and it is the correct explanation. But I've rejected God. I need an explanation. And along comes Darwinism, and I will hold on to that because it makes it possible for me to be intellectually fulfilled as an atheist, because now I have an alternate view, an alternate explanation for the world. Whether it's viable or not, I'm not going to think too much about that, because the alternative is creationism, and I'm not going to accept that. So how did the theory of evolution develop? It's interesting that Darwin was not the first one to push these. Anaximander of Miletus way back in 520 BC. But then when you get into the Enlightenment period, quite a number of scholars began to push this view. A fellow called Charles de Secondat Montesquieu lived from 1689 to 1755, wrote, "In the beginning, there were very few kinds of species, and the number has multiplied since by natural means." The Comte de Buffon, 1707 to 1788, taught that all animals had a common ancestor, including apes and men. Denis Diderot, 1713, 1784, famous for saying when he was asked about God, he said, "I have no need of that hypothesis." Diderot taught that all animals evolved from one original organism that gave rise to all others by natural selection. People will tell you that Darwin's genius was coming up with this idea of natural selection, but no, Diderot taught it long before Darwin. Then we have Erasmus Darwin, who was Charles's grandfather, 1731 to 1802. He taught evolution based on natural selection. We have Lamarck, 1744 to 1829. He taught constant spontaneous generation. In other words, life just keeps popping up out of non-life. And he taught evolution based on passing on acquired traits. Now, what's interesting here, do you know something interesting here, Jason?
Everything's already there.
Everything is already there. Everything that was in Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, was already taught by other people before Darwin did. And here's the question then, why was it not accepted then? Because there was no evidence for it. These people had these theories, these ideas, they gave no evidence, and so people rejected it. So what changed when Darwin published his book in 1859? He has not said anything that was not said before by other scholars. And he did not offer evidence. The ideas were rejected previously for lack of evidence. Now Charles presents them and he hasn't given evidence. And yet now it's accepted.
Interesting.
Yes, and why is that? Because they've reached that tipping point. This influence, this desire to get rid of God, which has been pushing ever since the start of the Enlightenment, which was supported by historical criticism, in other words, supposedly scholarly attacks on reliability of the Bible. Society was ready now to get rid of God.
So there's definitely some confirmation bias.
Oh, definitely. Darwin was telling people what they wanted to hear at this point, and that's why they accepted it. Why else otherwise? If it's been rejected before for lack of evidence, now it's accepted without new evidence. Why? Unless it's because it's telling people what they want to hear. So that's the background to the theory of evolution, where it came from, how it came about. And I've made the point, it might be provocative, that it's not really based on science. And so now we're going to get into your area of expertise, Jason, since you're an engineer, which means you know science. Would you say an engineer is better at science than a pure scientist, or not as good?
I would say that we would be just as good. We understand the scientific method, we perform experiments, analyze results.
Good answer, but I would say that the engineer is much better.
Why is that?
Because engineers deal in real life. We can't afford to play games with science. If I pretend, for example, that the second law of thermodynamics only applies to closed systems, the first chemical reactor I design will blow up. We can't play with that. We're doing it in the real world. We're applying it. The scientist can say whatever he wants because he doesn't have a real world consequence for that. So I would actually say that comparing an engineer to a pure scientist, is like comparing a Navy SEAL to a G.I. Joe action figure. So let's understand, you have the scientific expertise, we have it, so let's look at the science. And the reason theory of evolution gets away, particularly in schools, is because people don't understand what science actually is. Even a lot of science teachers, you ask for a working definition of science, they can't give you a good one. How would you define science?
So the scientific method, it consists of repeated observations, and it consists of an analysis of those observations, the data from it. And based on that, we aim to expand our understanding about the operation of the universe through the discovery of laws and development of theories.
Yeah, exactly. It's this systematic accumulation of knowledge by the scientific method. And the keys to the scientific method, understand, is observation. Whether you are studying the stars through a telescope, whether you're mixing chemicals in a test tube, you're observing phenomena, and you're looking for patterns. You're looking for things that always happen or things that never happen. For example, I pick up a pen and I drop it. Well, it fell, right? If I do it the second time, it will fall. I do it a third time, it will fall. If I do it 1,000,000 times, it falls 1,000,000 times. Can I prove that it will fall the 1,000,001st time? Can I prove that?
I don't think you can prove it, but based on your previous observations, you can assume that it will.
Exactly. See, told you, engineers are better. Yes, I cannot absolutely prove that it will fall the 1,000,001st time, but I can drop it and it will fall. But then I can't prove that it will fall the 1,000,002nd time. But I'm sure it will. And all of science works like that. We observe. We look for things that always happen in the same way under the same circumstances. And when we see that and we've made enough observations to be sure that it will always happen that way, it becomes a law. That's how we get the law of gravity. It uses what's called inductive logic. In deductive, you can be absolutely sure. Inductive is where you look at observation after observation after observation. George likes hockey, Dan likes hockey, Tim likes hockey, Steve likes hockey, Jason likes hockey, James likes hockey. You look at 100,000 boys that all like hockey. You don't find one who doesn't. Eventually, you conclude all boys like hockey. And that becomes your law. And it ceases to be the law if you ever find one boy who doesn't. Now, that's the scientific method. You observe. But what does that mean? It means science can only study things that happen over and over again. I need to be able to drop my pen and then drop it again and drop it again, drop it again. I need to be able to mix the same two chemicals in the test tube over and over again. What that means, and this is important to understand, science properly can only deal with a subset of knowledge. It can only deal with ongoing natural processes that are observable, that are repeatable. Anything outside of cannot be dealt with properly by science. And here's the mistake people make. They have absorbed, many of them even without knowing it, a philosophy called logical positivism, which means like, unless science can prove it, it can't be considered true. It means science can only study things that happen over and over again. What that means, and this is important to understand, science properly can only deal with a subset of knowledge. It can only deal with ongoing natural processes. Anything outside of that cannot be dealt with properly by science. And consider, for example, the assassination of President Kennedy or the assassination of President Lincoln. These are events that happened one time in the past. You can't rerun them. You can't put Lincoln's assassination into a test tube and run it again and again and again. You can't do with the Kennedy assassination what you do with the pencil, drop it over and over and over again. These things happen once and only once. And so it's a different field of knowledge. And the field is what's called history. This is how we know things like Caesar crossing the Rubicon in 49 BC, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, and so on. These things cannot be proven scientifically. And this mindset that's really being pushed in society today is that science is the only way to get true knowledge. Nothing else is really trustworthy. But that, of course, is a self-defeating philosophy, because the idea that only what science can prove, that's a philosophy called logical positivism, or sometimes referred to as scientism. That claim that only what science can prove is true is a claim that cannot be proven by science. And so it is a self-defeating idea. In point of fact, we can trust history. Obviously, we have better information for some things than for others, but it's easy to demonstrate. If we asked you, for example, Jason, where were you born?
Edmonton, Alberta.
How do you know that?
It says on my birth certificate, and that's what my parents tell me, so.
Could you prove that, though, scientifically?
Probably not.
Yeah, I wouldn't see a scientific way to prove it, but I don't see that anybody would doubt it. This is a matter of history. You were born at one time and one place, and it can't be repeated. Physically, you cannot be born again. You cannot be, it's one time. And for that, you depend on historical knowledge. Eyewitnesses, your mom was certainly there, and historical documents, your birth certificate. So these are historical facts. It's a different way to know things. There's a whole subset of knowledge out there that is not accessible to science, but that doesn't mean it's any less certain. And you really shouldn't allow people to try to get away with telling you that somehow this is less trustworthy. Now, going back to the nature of science, you remember it's based on observation and reproducibility. In other words, you're looking at something that happens, and you see that it happens, and every time under the same circumstances, it happens the same way. You study these phenomena. You try to find some ways to violate it, some ways to make it not happen the same way under the same circumstances, but they always do. And when we've tried it enough times to know that this is always going to happen, it becomes what we call a law of science. Now, laws are proven inductively, not deductively. So I can drop the pencil 1,000,000 times, and every time it falls, I can't absolutely prove that it will fall the 1,000,001st time, but I'm sure it will. These are laws of science. Statements of what always happen and never violated under the same circumstances. You can model some of them mathematically, not all of them. That law of gravity that was discovered by Newton way back in the 17th century, we found it's actually not just the pen falling towards the table. What he found is that any two masses attract each other. There's a force of attraction between any two masses. But since the mass of the Earth is so much bigger than the mass of the pen, we don't notice the Earth moving towards the pen. We only see the pen moving towards the Earth. And he formulated his law of gravity, where the force of attraction between two masses, the force measured in newtons, between two masses, m1 and m2 measured in kilograms, and separated by a distance of d measured in meters, or r. G is the gravitational constant. So his law of gravity, force of gravity, is equal to G times m1 times m2 over r squared. That's law of gravity. He didn't know what the G was, so it wasn't until 1798 that Henry Cavendish calculated through a brilliant experiment, 6.67 times 10 to the minus 11 Newton meters squared per kilogram squared. So laws that always do the same thing in the same way. They are regular. They're predictable. And that's what the law tells us, what will happen. The next part of the scientific method after that is to try to figure out why things happen. And here's where we get into hypotheses and theories. I wonder, why does the pen always fall when I drop it? Well, I make a hypothesis. That's an idea, suggestion, to explain the phenomenon. And my hypothesis is that we are surrounded by gigantic invisible snails. And these snails hate to see things floating. So as soon as you let go of the pen, they don't want it to float, so the snails grab it and pull it down to the table. That's my hypothesis. Okay? And then the scientist will test his hypothesis. He will try to prove it to be wrong by running it through an experiment. In my case, I know that salt kills snails, so my experiment goes like this. I take a big box of salt, I scatter it all around here. get every single bit of space. So if they're giant invisible snails, they're dead. Salt kills snails, they're dead, so they cannot pull my pen down. And then I let my pen go. If my hypothesis is correct, the pen should float. It doesn't float. My hypothesis is wrong. On the other hand, if I have a better hypothesis and it passes a number of tests successfully, eventually it's elevated to the level of a theory. It's a hypothesis that has passed a number of experimental tests and remains viable. And here's a mistake people make. They confuse laws and theories. They will say that once a theory is certain enough, it gets elevated to the status of a law. It really doesn't. You see, because that's a category error. A law tells you what happens, and it's simply based on your observation, your experiments. It's the most certain knowledge yielded by science. The theory is an attempt to explain why it happens. Now, you will find people today, even scientists, saying, oh, well, we could also use theory as kind of an overarching model to explain a number of different observations. If you want to do that, you can. But do remember, a theory never becomes a law. It's two certainly different things. And this is something that evolutionists always get wrong. They actually try to mock creationists on this. You will see posters, bumper stickers, t-shirts, saying things like, evolution is just a theory, kind of like gravity. And it's meant to make you think that you're really stupid to try to downgrade evolution on the basis that it's just a theory when so is gravity. But gravity isn't. Gravity is a law. We can observe it. We can do experiments on it. We can do it, reproduce results and so on. You can't do that with evolution. Gravity is a law. Now, there are theories of gravity, attempts to explain why things fall. Einstein's theory of curved space, which I don't think is a very good theory, but there's a difference. There are theories of gravity. They're not certain at all. It's not to be confused with the law, and yet you see these kind of t-shirts again and again. Evolution is just a theory, then again, so is gravity. Or this one that says, if you can say evolution is just a theory with a straight face, you obviously don't know anything about either. Which is ironic because the person wearing that t-shirt, by doing so, demonstrates that he does not know about either of them. Now, which trumps which? In science, is a law subject to a theory or is a theory subject to a law? What would you think?
Yeah, the theory would be subject to the law.
Why?
Well, if a theory violates a law, that means the theory is wrong.
Exactly. The law tells us what happens. A theory is the attempt to explain why. So if our theory tells us that what happens doesn't actually happen, then it's obviously a false theory. For example, if we come to a nice glade in the forest and we see an apple tree there and we see that there are these nice red apples on the tree branches, and we're wondering, how did the apples get in the tree? And I have a theory. And my theory is that apples grow on the ground, tiny little things, and as they grow, they get bigger, they turn red, and when they reach a certain size, they break loose from the ground and float up into the tree and attach themselves to a branch. That's my theory. What do you think of it?
Well, you can try to prove whether that theory is correct by maybe putting some kind of obstacle in the way, and you can see whether or not that's true.
You could do that, but in this case, does that theory violate a law?
Yeah, it violates the law of gravity.
Yeah, so if it violates the law of gravity, that means it's a non-starter. Any theory that violates a law, what do we do with it?
We discard it.
Has to be discarded, exactly. One more point to discuss before we get into the facts and evidence surrounding evolution, supposedly. It's what I call the murder of John Doe. Imagine that you are a homicide detective. You've just been called to the scene of a murder. John Doe has just been killed. There's a knife stuck in him. Blood is still oozing out of the wound, so he was killed very recently. And even before your CSI team comes on site, begins to look for evidence, even before they report anything, you remember something about John Doe. You remember he had an enemy, a fellow called George Smith, who hated him, wanted him dead. And immediately in your head, George Smith jumps to the top of your potential suspect list. It's nothing but a vague idea at the moment. But your CSI team, as they examine things, conclude that the killer was a left-handed man. And you remember that George Smith was left-handed. And so he looks a little better for the killing. And then your CSI team tells you the killer has red hair. And you remember that George Smith has red hair. He's a red-headed man. And now you have 3 lines of evidence all converging on George Smith as the killer. The CSI team tells you the killer must have been over 6 feet tall. And you remember that George Smith is 6'3". Looking even better. And then here comes the clincher. Your CSI team tells you the killer was a hunchback. And you know that George Smith is a hunchback. And how many 6-foot-tall hunchbacks are there? So, not a lot. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines of evidence converging on George Smith as the murderer. You send out your unis to go and arrest him, bring him in. But they don't. They report back to you, we did not arrest George Smith. You ask them why. And they tell you, George Smith died 6 years ago. So here's the thing to remember. You can have lines of evidence supporting an idea. But if other facts make the idea impossible, then it's a non-starter. Lines of evidence that are consistent with one view may also be consistent with a different view. But as long as at least one thing makes that conclusion impossible, it's pointless to look at the other evidence and say, see, it must have happened. What kind of a homicide detective would say, but George Smith must have done it. Look, he's left-handed. He has red hair. He's a 6-foot-tall hunchback. He must have done it. When, in fact, he died 6 years ago, he did not do it. The killer must have been another red-headed, left-handed, 6-foot-tall hunchback. You know, they may not be common, but there must be another one because George Smith did not do it. We have to remember that. So we leave off here with Sherlock Holmes' dictum from the book The Sign of the Four, where he said, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And so now let's get into the meat of things here. Okay? This is background in basic science, which is we need to have. Now we can look at things. We have seen that there are, in fact, only 2 possibilities to explain the world and the life in it. Either it was created by God or it came about by random natural processes, which is theory of evolution. And since there are only 2 possibilities, as Holmes says, if one of them is impossible, the other one must be true. So we don't have to prove creation. If evolution, if naturalistic explanations for the origins of the world and the life in it are impossible, then creationism is thereby shown to be true by our law of excluded middle. Now, there may be facts consistent with evolution, but as we saw with the murder of John Doe, if there are other facts that make evolution impossible, then creationism must be true. Any questions? Anything not clear on the nature of science or where we're going with this?
No, this sounds good.
And let's remember that Jason is an engineer. Yep. What type of engineer?
Mechanical engineer.
Still engineer, though. Yeah. And he's finishing his master's. So he knows the science. If we say something bogus here, he will spot it. So now let's look at the science of evolution. There are, in fact, several different elements to the theory of evolution and to naturalistic origins of life. Usually when people talk about evolution, they want to talk only about biological evolution, which is where you go from that first simple cell to living creatures of all the different sorts we see on Earth today and all the different sorts that have gone extinct in the eons since life began. Now, if we look just at the biological part, you know what? You can't do that because we have to look at where did that first cell come from. People want to remove that and say that's not part of the theory of evolution. They often get actually angry when you bring up these points, but we have to do it because it is certainly relevant to the theory of evolution. To actually look at life on Earth, there are 4 steps, 4 things that absolutely have to happen. And the 4 things are, you start out, and we mentioned this before, you start with simple chemicals in perhaps warm water as little oceans on the surface of the early Earth. And these have to come together to form complex, ordered macromolecules. And there actually have to be three different lines of these: your metabolic line, your enzymic line, and your genetic line. Some of those simple chemicals have to combine into amino acids, which then have to combine into complex proteins. Along the metabolic line, you need your lipids and your phospholipids, fatty acids, and so on. The genetic line, you're going to need these nucleotides coming together: purines, pyrimidines, sugars, nucleic acids, and eventually nucleotides joining together to give you RNA and DNA. You need all three of these, and you need lots of them. One protein won't do it for you. You need an awful lot of these molecules. And then they have to get together and form that cell structure. That is what we call chemical evolution. And then there's another crucial step here. And that crucial step here is somehow that cell structure has to go, because right now it's just a conglomeration of chemicals, it has to go from non-living to living. It has to come to life. There's a barrier that has to be crossed going from non-living to living. And then once it does that, once you have that first primordial cell, in order to develop into all of the different forms of life on Earth today, it needs lots and lots of new genetic data. In Darwin's day, they didn't know about genetics. Darwin claimed that evolution was based on variation. He had no explanation for where the variation came from. But he said there's variation and that gives you evolution. And his theory was almost dead in the water eventually in the early 20th century, where they couldn't explain the variation. And then they mixed in genetics. And we know now, the gene code inside your cells, your DNA, extremely complex information-bearing molecules. Bill Gates said that it's like a software program, only very, very much more complicated than any program we've ever seen, any program we've ever been able to write. So you have these super complex computer code equivalents. Where did they come from? Who wrote the program? Could they just come together by random chance? Well, that's the theory of evolution. Yes, they just came about by your random natural processes. So already, if we leave out two other elements, we see already 4 essential steps. These are necessary for the theory of evolution to be possible. And if any one of them is impossible, then that's the end for the theory of evolution, if we're going by real science. Step number 1, simple chemicals: carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, carbon monoxide, hydrogen gas, and so on, must spontaneously, so without any intelligence doing it, spontaneously self-assemble into complex organic molecules, proteins, DNA, and so on. Number 2, the complex organic molecules must self-assemble into a cell. Number 3, the cell has to come to life. And then number 4, the DNA coding of this cell must develop vast amounts of qualitatively new, meaningful genetic data. This is what the 4 steps that have to happen for the theory of evolution to work. Now, as I said, the evolutionists will like to scream and say that no, that chemical evolution part, that's not really part of the theory of evolution. We're not talking about that. But yes, it is. The theory of evolution encompasses far more than just the simple idea of how hereditary information is propagated through generations. That's the sort of thing they might tell you. It is, understand, and we looked at this before from Professor Larson, Edward J. Larson, that really what's behind the theory of evolution is a desire to push out God. So it's meant to be a comprehensive, materialistic explanation for life in all its forms, which does, of course, necessarily include life's origin. And that massive book from the year 2009 called Evolution, the First 4 Billion Years, editors Michael Roos, and anybody who follows the field of evolution knows Michael Roos. He's one of the top writers on this topic. Editors Michael Roos and Joseph Travis write this, quote, "From the history of evolutionary thought to the controversies over education, from the fossil record and the origin of life to the process of adaptation, the long essays offer primers on the major features of evolution." So there you have it from Roos and Travis in this book. The origin of life is one of the major features of evolution. When people deny it, it's generally because they know they have no explanation for it. They know it can't work. Okay, but we'll get into that. We should also mention that there's a third type of evolution that's necessary if you want to get rid of God, and that's what's called the cosmic evolution, cosmogony. Where did the universe come from in the first place? It's all well and good to talk about simple chemicals in the warm little ponds on the surface of the early Earth, but we have to ask, where did the early Earth come from? Where did the warm little ponds come from? And where did those simple chemicals come from? So where did it come from? It is here. It is structured. It is organized, the Earth. It has a shape, it has structure. We might look at this more in detail later, but right now, let's look at some basics. Where did the universe come from? Now, there's the possibility that it's always been here. Okay? And that's generally where evolutionists have to go, that the material universe is eternal. And the question is, can that be true? Can the universe have just always been here? What do you think?
I would say no. If we want to measure time, for example, we would have to have a starting point for time. So, yeah, there would have to be a starting point.
Yes, you've hit on the key point. The universe is not just here, but it endures in time. It is passing through time. Yesterday is gone, today is here, tomorrow's not here yet. And when we get to tomorrow, it'll be the new today. The time we're in right now will be yesterday, it'll be gone, we can't go back to it. We're always moving forward in the time stream. Now, if something endures in time, can it be existing from infinity in the past? Absolutely not, and here's why. Consider, for example, an infinite staircase. Infinite staircase. How long would it take you to climb halfway up an infinite staircase?
Infinity.
Yeah, could you ever get halfway up an infinite staircase?
Nope.
No, you'd still be taking step after step after step after step. You could never get halfway up. What about a third of the way up?
Same thing.
Quarter of the way up?
Same, yeah.
Yeah, you absolutely couldn't. You could not reach any specific step if the staircase went back into infinity past. It's the same thing with time. If time went back into infinity past, you could never reach any specific point in time. And yet we have. Here we are. It's the year 2021. We've reached a specific point in time, moving through time to get there. If time had been existing backwards into infinity, we could not be in 2021, and yet here we are. Attempts to claim that, well, maybe the universe didn't exist in time before is a really rather desperate fairy tale. The universe does endure in time. And as we'll see later as well from thermodynamics, the universe is running down, headed towards universal thermal equilibrium, commonly known as heat death of the universe. So if the universe had been here for infinity past, we'd be at heat death already, and the universe would just be a cold, dead place. Mm-hmm. So from the point of view of not just philosophy, but science and common sense, the world cannot have been here forever, which means we have to have an explanation for where it came from. And now we're back to that issue that it either came about by random natural processes or God had to create it. And now you're stuck because you have no universe. Cannot always be here, so it had to come into being at some point in the past. Before it came into being, there was nothing. How does nothing give you something? Well, now you got some physicists who are actually trying to argue for that. And they're trying to run kind of scams on people, basically trafficking on the fact that most people don't really understand advanced science. A certain physicist named Lawrence Krauss brought out a book a few years back called A Universe from Nothing, Why There's Something Rather Than Nothing. And Krauss tries to explain that, yeah, nothing can give rise to something. In an interview, it's summarized this way. Attempting to reconcile quantum mechanics with general relativity may suggest, as both Hawking and I agree, that all the space and time of our universe might have arisen from nothing, as a spontaneous quantum fluctuation without the need for any supernatural shenanigans. What do you think of that?
I don't know. Sounds pretty crazy to me.
Yeah. See, as soon as they bring up quantum mechanics and general relativity, most of the general public just retreats. They have no idea what those even are. And these guys sound so sophisticated. So we can't answer this, but if they're saying it and it sounds so sophisticated, who are we to disagree? But it's absolute rubbish. It's absolute rubbish what they're saying. And there's so many ways you can show that it's absolute rubbish. Quantum mechanics operates on submicroscopic scales at the level of subatomic particles. It doesn't apply at the level of universes. Where subatomic particles supposedly pop in existence, they pop back out of existence immediately. And the bigger it is, the faster it pops back out of existence. You can have something popping out of nothing and staying there. But the biggest problem is you can't have quantum fluctuations without a quantum field. And a quantum field is not nothing. It is an energy field. It is something. So this is complete bluff. And anybody who knows even basic science, well, okay, maybe not basic science, maybe not what you learned in high school, but anyone who knows science knows that this is nonsense. But this is what they have to resort to push God out. Now, let's get back to basic science, laws of science. The most certain laws of science are the laws of thermodynamics. And the first law of thermodynamics is?
Yes, it's that matter and also energy, they can't be created or destroyed. They're always conserved, meaning that at most you can change them from one form to another.
Yes, it's what used to be called the law of conservation of matter. The amount of matter in the universe is fixed, and that's all you have. You can change it from one form to another, but you can never make more by any natural process or get rid of any. Now, eventually they discovered that energy and matter are actually interchangeable. You can change energy into matter, or more commonly, matter into energy. That's how nuclear explosions work. But the sum total of matter-energy cannot be created or destroyed. The sum total is all that is there. So here's the problem. If matter-energy cannot be created by any natural process, and the universe can't have existed forever, it had to have come into being from somewhere, how did matter-energy get created when a law of science, okay, remember, we're saying a law against a theory now, how did it get created if the first law of thermodynamics says it can't happen? What do you do? So this idea violates a fundamental law of science. What has to happen to the theory?
It has to be discarded.
It has to go. It absolutely has to go. What do the evolutionists do with this? They get desperate. They'll say things like, the laws of physics didn't exist at earliest moments of the universe, which is, I'm sorry, that's special pleading on steroids. That's completely out of the realm of science. Laws are the most certain things that science yields. To just arbitrarily say, the laws didn't hold then, just so I can continue to hold to my atheism, sorry. No reasonable person will accept that.
Then, as a creationist, how would you explain where all these things came from?
Go right back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashemayim va'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Remember, the law is matter-energy cannot be created or destroyed by any natural process. God doesn't create by natural process. He creates by miracle. And that is the actual only viable explanation now. Because if it can't be done by any natural process, the only explanation is a supernatural process, which is creation. And so this is why, and I've shown another radio show, that the mere fact that the world exists and life in it proves there's a God. Okay? It just absolutely destroys the idea of atheism. That is not an intellectually viable view. So, this universe cannot always have been here, but also cannot have come into existence by natural process. Atheism, as we said, it's dead in the water, even before we start looking at chemical evolution and biological evolution. Now, as we get to chemical evolution, remember, this is where simple chemicals had to spontaneously self-assemble into complex ordered macromolecules, proteins, DNA, RNA, and so on. Before we look at the viability of that, let's look at another law of science. This one is the second law of thermodynamics, also known as the law of entropy. And this is the one, out of all the laws of science, this is the one that is considered the absolute most certain law of science. And it says all natural processes tend towards increasing disorder from specified complexity to randomness. And this is a law everybody knows. They may not know that this is the second law of thermodynamics, but they know it. And let me illustrate how they know it. Imagine a cabin out in the forest. It's built of logs and glass and tiles. It's got a little front porch. It's got rooms inside and a balcony on the upper level, a nice peaked roof, gables, and so on. So if I ask you, if I leave this untouched for hundreds of years, what's going to happen to it?
It's probably going to break down over time.
It's going to break down, decay, rot away, eventually turn into a pile of rubble. Now, if I ask you, take a pile of rubble, and if I leave that alone for hundreds of years, will it turn into a house?
No.
How long would I have to leave it to have it turn spontaneously into a house?
Not sure if it ever will.
It never will. Okay? And everybody knows that. Everybody knows things always break down. They always go from complex to random. It's never the other way around. Imagine taking firewood, for example. Firewood, cut down the trees. Those are very complex, organized cells in there, and the different layers, and the phylum, and the zone, and so on, within the wood. Very complex, organized structure. You touch a match to it, well, it burns, and eventually you're left with a pile of ash. Can I touch a match to a pile of ash and have it turn back into firewood?
No.
Absolutely not. And this is what I mean. Like, everybody knows. This is secular thermodynamics. Every natural process goes from complex structure, complex order, to simple disorder. Everybody knows that. Instinctively, from experience, is what they see all around them. Because I say, they may not know that's the second law of thermodynamics, that's the law of entropy, but it is. And this is why entropy always wins at the end. This is why you start as a good-looking young man, and eventually, you know what happens? You get old, your hair falls out, your hair turns white, your skin begins to sag, your health breaks down, and eventually you die. Why is that? It's the law of entropy. And entropy always wins at the end. You know, we try to forestall it. We exercise, we eat food, put in more energy, our body turns it into new proteins, rebuild muscles. So, yeah, we can forestall it for a while, but in the end, entropy always wins. An old man never turns young. The young man always turns old. That's thermodynamics. Second law of thermodynamics. So, as I said, it's unavoidable. It's inevitable. Now, driving forces of chemical processes. You can get simple structures forming in nature. And that's by the electrostatic attractions between molecules. For example, if you look at a salt crystal, you'll see this nice lattice structure where you have the sodium molecule joined to a chlorine molecule, joined to a sodium molecule, joined to a chlorine molecule. And in 3 dimensions, so you get this nice kind of lattice structure. And people say, isn't this a violation of the second law of thermodynamics? Explain why it's not.
Well, there are forces of attraction that bring the sodium molecule together and the chlorine molecule together. Even though there's decrease in entropy when these things come together, there's entropy increasing elsewhere in the system around it.
What happens to the enthalpy here?
It goes downwards.
Yeah, exactly. See, here's the thing. There are actually 2 driving forces for all chemical reactions. They seek lowest energy state, which is lowest enthalpy. That's the technical word for the energy. It wants low energy state. It wants stability. And it also wants maximum disorder. Now, sometimes these 2 work against each other. In the case of a crystal, it's a much lower energy state. So even though it creates order, it still happens, because in this case, the drive to lower energy is stronger than the drive to higher entropy. But it only is because the entropy, or the order, is actually very simple. It's not complex. It's not specified. It's a simple repeating order: chlorine, sodium, chlorine, sodium, chlorine, sodium, chlorine, sodium. So it's called symmetric redundancy. So it's very, very simple order. And yes, there are processes in nature, like crystal formation, where you can get simple order forming naturally. But don't let the evolutionist appeal to this, because again, this is simple order. It's not complex order. If you look at the macromolecules that you need for organic evolution, They're extremely complex. You need to have amino acids all arranged in the exact right order. And how many amino acids? It could be 100, it could be 300, it could be 30,000. So the entropy there, the loss that you'd have of entropy, this kind of complex order is far beyond the ability of any enthalpy effect to overcome it. It just absolutely cannot happen. So no, second law of thermodynamics will tell you that those complex molecules you would need to form that first cell can never form on their own. It's game over for evolution right there. Absolutely game over right there. Again, they will try to evade, they will try to obfuscate. They will often bring up what's called the Urey-Miller experiment that was done in 1953. And here, two scientists, science professor and his grad student, devised an experiment to try to show how life arose on Earth. And what they did here is they took glass ball, basically, put in some water. That was your oceanic compartment. And then they would heat the water so it would become water vapor. It would run up through a glass tube into another glass ball, basically. And in this glass ball, you had those simple chemicals that they thought the early Earth's atmosphere would have had. Nitrogen gas, methane, ammonia, carbon dioxide, hydrogen gas. And in came your water vapor, and then they had a little electric spark. Okay, they call this the atmospheric compartment. And the little spark was supposed to create life. And lo and behold, what happened? Well, they came up with a few simple amino acids. And to see this proves life could have formed by natural processes. Game over. You will still hear books appealing to that. And even professors appealing to that. But it did nothing of the sort. Amino acids are not proteins. Amino acids are relatively very simple. But here's the thing, even the amino acids that formed broke down immediately. So it was absolutely useless for showing how life originated. It broke down immediately, and what Urey and Miller had to do was put in a cold water trap, essentially flash cool the products to keep them from breaking back down, okay? And then extracting them from the apparatus. So it was a scam right there. You can also point out that what they thought was the gases of the early atmosphere are wrong. They had no oxygen there. Now we know that the early atmosphere had oxygen, and that would have oxidized any of these products. So it's absolutely impossible. Furthermore, as I said, a few simple amino acids, no proteins even, let alone a cell, let alone something coming to life. So the fact that this experiment is still held forward as to explain the problem of the origin of life, let's put it there and let's not ask any more about it. Let's just accept that this answers the problem and move on. It's fundamentally intellectually dishonest and an admission that they know with no explanation for how life came on Earth. Amino acids, as I said, are relatively simple. You have a carbon, the alpha carbon, an amino group, which is nitrogen with two hydrogens. You have a carboxylic group, carbon with a couple of oxygens and a hydrogens, and then a side chain. So it's not particularly complex. Proteins, on the other hand, are amazingly complex. Not only is there you have to have all of these amino acids in the right order, which I mentioned before. That's just the primary structure. There's a secondary structure where the protein can be a pleated sheet or an alpha helix, and then a tertiary structure where those are bent together, and then a quaternary that folds in on itself. Extremely complex. And if any of these four elements is missing, the protein doesn't work. So the Urey-Miller experiment is absolutely useless to explain the origin of life on Earth. How can you escape this fundamental problem? How can you get around the problem of the law of entropy and how it destroys any ability, any possibility of life originating on Earth by any natural process? And desperate evolutionists want to know. Desperate atheists want to know. Or they just bury their head in the sand and try not to think about it. What you will usually hear is what's called the open system gambit. And once again, like with Krauss and his quantum mechanics, this is based on hoping that the general public just doesn't understand science enough that they can actually put this gambit and get away with it. How does this gambit? Here's how Bill Nye puts it in his book, Undeniable: Evolution and the Science of Creation. He writes this: as a mechanical engineer, oh, look at that, he's a fellow mechanical engineer, Jason, though I don't think he has a master's. As a mechanical engineer who took a lot of physics, I am fascinated by the particular creationist argument because it is both scientifically subtle and completely misinformed. Here's the most important thing to know. The second law applies only to closed systems like a cylinder in a car engine, and the Earth is not even remotely a closed system. Transfers of matter and energy are constantly taking place. Energy has been pouring in from the sun for over 4.5 billion years. That's from page 21 of his book. Do you see anything problematic? Just at first glance, do you see anything problematic in what he's saying?
Yeah, I mean, a cylinder in a car engine isn't a closed system.
Exactly. So, I mean, it's just our mechanical engineer's credibility takes a hit right away when he says a cylinder in a car engine is a closed system. So that's already a problem. It's not the only problem, of course, when we get into the science of it. It's like people have to understand what does he even mean by a closed system? And even that's not correct, because really he should be talking about an isolated system, not a closed system. Mm-hmm. A closed system is a system where, let's start with open system. An open system is where you can have free exchange of energy and matter within the system. You can put mass into the system, you can take mass out, you can put energy in, take energy out. In a closed system, you cannot transfer mass. You cannot put matter in or take matter out. You can still put in energy or take it out. An isolated system is one where you cannot put in or take out either of them. You cannot put in matter, take out matter. You cannot put in energy, take out energy. When he says closed system, and most of these evolutionists, when they say closed system, what they really mean is an isolated system. And they say that the second law of thermodynamics only holds for closed systems. And they say, oh, look, the Earth is not closed. You can put energy into it. The sun is putting energy into it all the time, and the sun's energy will allow order to result. The sun's energy will override the second law of thermodynamics. And the question, is that true? What would you say?
I would say for very particular local systems, that could be the case. For example, the sun providing energy to a plant. It's already there for the plant to grow, and the plant then assembles more of itself. But if nothing was there to begin with and the sun input, I'm not too sure.
That's actually very interesting to bring up the plant, because a human does that too. But here's the thing. The plant has chloroplasts. Mm-hmm. It has an organized machine that can take the free energy from the sun and convert it into usable energy, chemical energy, which it can then burn, process, and use that to do things. Mm-hmm. Same thing with human beings. We can convert energy. We take in the chemical energy by eating plants. Yep. And then our cells convert that. The mitochondria will convert that to a very complex process into energy that our body uses. And this is how, as I say, we forestall the effects of entropy for a while. Mm-hmm. And we can even use that to create order. I can use the chemical energy of food and my brain to take wood and build it into a house. So yes, where you have two things, you have to have a machine that can convert free energy into a usable form. Mm-hmm. And there has to be some kind of design, blueprint, or intelligence to use that energy. Then it can. But what Nye is saying is you can just put free energy into a system, and that's all you need to override the second law of thermodynamics. But if that's the case, we would never even have discovered it. Because you put free energy into the Earth, and piles of rubble should be turning into houses, shouldn't they? And we just told us that putting free energy into a system will override entropy. So why do we not see piles of bricks and rubble turning into houses? The house is a lot less complex than a cell. Why do we not see piles of ashes spontaneously turning into firewood? There must be something wrong with what Nye is saying, and indeed there is. The second law of thermodynamics is defined in terms of a closed system, so we can get rid of all their effects. But it holds for all natural processes. Holds for all natural processes. The crystal formation. As I said, the reason crystals form is because you have this driving force to lower enthalpy, lower energy, as well as the force to higher entropy. So when we define the second law of thermodynamics, we say, well, let's not worry about the effects of energy. We'll look at just what entropy does, and that's why we'll put it into an isolated system so we don't have to worry about the energy. But in fact, the second law holds for all natural processes. The only difference is that with natural processes, you do have to account for the effects of energy. And we do that through what's called the Gibbs free energy equation, and it holds for all natural processes, regardless of whether the system is open, closed, or isolated. And it's actually very easy to demonstrate this. It's very easy to demonstrate that what Nye says is nonsense. The open system gambit is nonsense. The sun puts free energy into the earth, yes. Well, we know what happens when you put free energy into a system. What happens when you have a sun release of free energy in a system? Give us an example from Earth.
The sun releasing free energy?
No, when we put any kind of free energy into a system, like it's not directed to a machine to do useful work, you just have a sun release of free energy. What happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think of a nuclear reactor just going kaboom when it's not controlled.
Or any kind of explosion. Even when you have like controlled explosions to knock down an old building, what happens? You get destruction. You get massive disorder. When you put free energy into a system, it doesn't give you order. It gives you disorder. And the more free energy you put in, the more disorder you get. If you go back to that house in the forest, instead of the house in the forest, let's put that house out on the equator in an open field where it gets a maximum benefit of the sun's free energy. Is it going to break down faster?
Yeah, the sun's rays will probably break it down faster, yeah.
Yeah, or is it going to like build new additions and new wings onto the building? So what they're saying is just absolute nonsense. Anybody who knows science knows that. Okay? But they don't want to know that. We can illustrate this perfectly by means of a refrigerator. What is the purpose of a refrigerator?
Cool down our food.
Why?
Otherwise, it'll rot.
Exactly. It's to slow down the rate of spoilage. That's why we put it in the refrigerator. Now, the refrigerator is insulated. Okay, so it's effectively an isolated system. When we open the door, free energy gets in. When the door is closed, it's isolated. So what happens when we open the door too often?
Food will probably start going bad faster.
It goes bad faster. Yeah, if we keep the door closed, it goes bad more slowly. Does the food ever become more fresh?
Unfortunately not.
Absolutely not. So here's the thing. We have a system. If it's isolated, you don't put in free energy, then the rate of entropy formation, how fast you get disorder, slows down. If you put in free energy, opening the door all the time, the rate of spoilage, the rate of entropy formation, the rate of disorder goes up. Put in free energy, don't put in free energy, will affect how fast order turns to disorder, but it will never reverse it. So the idea that the sun putting free energy into the earth will change things and make it get ordered is nonsense. And we're back to now that people, young man becoming an old man, does the sun shine on us to make us get younger?
No.
No, absolutely not. Quite the opposite. I saw on TV a few years back, they were featuring this truck driver who'd been driving a truck for decades. And he'd always had he's on the left side, he always had his window open. And so it's just left side of his face exposed to the sun. The right side wasn't so much. And after decades, what happened? You look at his face, the left side is completely marred, the skin is dry, it's all lumpy and bumpy. The right side looks smooth and much younger. Putting free energy into a system makes the entropy develop faster. And they know it. So now their latest scam now is we'll call this emergent phenomena. Now it's just, we make up a fancy term. We call it emergent phenomena as if, now the second law of thermodynamics doesn't apply anymore, as long as we call it that. So really, when it comes to this fundamental step, could you ever have had simple chemicals joined together to give you the organized macromolecules you need to do this? The answer is no. They are totally bluffing. It's interesting, Sky and Telescope ran this article some years back, 2010, where they're appealing to emergent phenomenon. Life exists because we live in a universe where energy flowing through a system tends to organize that system into ever more complex and unpredictable forms. Now, that's just like flat out denying the second law of thermodynamics. So you may as well be telling that 2 + 2 = toaster. That's how wrong it is. It's not even 2 + 2 = 5. This is 2 + 2 = kumquat. And they actually have the chutzpah to put into brackets there. The second law of thermodynamics is not violated. Organization happens at the expense of heat or disorganized energy leaving the system. So you close the refrigerator door, heat is sucked out of the system through the heat pump, so now the food does get fresher, right?
According to them, yes.
That's what they're trying to tell you. When those forms qualify as alive, okay, which will be a fun thing we'll look at later, what actually makes things come to life, biologists call the energy flow metabolism. So this is what they said, and I actually sent them a letter to the editor and pointed out that this is not true. And actually published my letter. My letter said, if it were true that energy flowing through a system tends to organize that system into ever more complex and unpredictable forms, we should be seeing piles of bricks and rubble spontaneously turning into houses all over the place. And ashes should be spontaneously turning into firewood. I believe that the reason we do not see such things is because the energy flowing through systems tends to disorganize them, not organize them, like explosions, for example. Furthermore, any engineer can tell you that inputting free energy into a system as the sun does to the earth increases the rate of disorganization. It does not reverse it. The second law of thermodynamics, therefore, does stand as an insurmountable obstacle to all theories of chemical evolution. Now, look at the answer here. You're confusing violations of the second law of thermodynamics, bricks jumping up to form houses, with emergent phenomena. Energy flowing through a system causing local organization at the expense of increased entropy elsewhere. You see this happening throughout nature, from complex turbulence appearing spontaneously in fluid flow, to life processes driven by sunlight increasing in complexity over billions of years to do things like build houses. Would you like to respond to their response, Jason?
Yeah, it doesn't seem like they get to the bottom of where life came from, though.
Anything else jump out at you?
Yes. Billions of years would be required.
Billions, you can have as many years as you want. It's not going to happen. The first thing is you're confusing violations of the second law of thermodynamics with emergent phenomena. It's like, oh, we've made up this term now. We're calling it emergent phenomena. Don't talk about second law of thermodynamics, which says that energy flowing through an energy will disorganize things, because we have emergent phenomena. We'll tell you it does the opposite, which it doesn't. Second law of thermodynamics applies to all natural processes. So, but we've made up a new term, you see. And according to our new term, yes, this can happen. Never mind the real science. Never mind the fact that the most certain law of science tells you it can happen. We have proclaimed that it does. And our proof is evolution. Our proof is that life did evolve. Our proof is that chemicals did combine to give life. Well, that's the whole question, though, isn't it? You can't assume that happened to prove that it could happen. So here's another interesting example. And this came up when one of my daughters was in university. The biology course was promoting theory of evolution, trying to get them to believe it. In the chemistry course, the chemistry professor gave an optional lecture to deal with this very issue. Now, I don't know if anybody brought it up, the problem of the second law of thermodynamics for chemical evolution, or they knew it would come up. So he had a special lecture to explain why it's not. He asked, is it impossible for really, really complex molecules to form spontaneously from simple elements? No. And he actually had a reaction process graph there, plotting energy against reaction process. At the beginning as simple hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, and phosphorus, and it requires a bit of activation energy, but then the energy drops. The energy drops by the time you get to complex DNA at the other side of the graph, and he shows that the delta G, the change in the Gibbs free energy, is negative. He says the majority of biological molecules have delta G of formation negative, below zero, which means, of course, it can happen. So he put this graph in front of people, and their first-year chemistry students, it's unlikely any of them would have caught the complete scam here. But you're an engineer, you catch the scam, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, he starts from simple hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, and so on, but you have to go from the point of the forms of where these elements actually come from. So they aren't necessarily free and able to just turn into these complex DNA.
Exactly. See, it's not going to fool a graduate engineer. It'll fool first-year students. Why does he start out with simple hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, phosphorus? Because the delta G of formation by definition is zero. So, of course, you can get a negative delta G here. But simple hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, phosphorus don't exist in nature. If you had them, they would instantly join up to form simple chemicals. The hydrogen would join with the oxygen and give you water. Nitrogen would join with hydrogen and give you ammonia. The carbon would join with the oxygen and give you carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and so on. And if you want to get the DNA, that's what you would have to start with. You would first have to break those apart. And their delta G of formation are big. So the reality here is this graph is a scam. Delta G of formation of molecules is hugely positive and cannot happen. I actually wrote up a paper on this, explaining why this is a scam. And I had some of my peeps went down to the lecture hall and handed this out to the students. So they were reading it. And then the professor came in and he saw it and he read it. And he said, who wrote this? Who wrote this? And of course I wasn't there, so there's nobody to say yes. And all he could say was, oh, see, he's afraid to face me. But he couldn't deny what I was saying. So again, you wonder, why are they pushing this theory of evolution against the science? Why are they pushing it so determinedly? Because you got to get rid of God. Let's look again at the possibility. Now, suppose you could get those simple proteins forming, your amino acids forming, and so on. Could they self-assemble into the proteins? Well, let's look. I put together this little wooden man. And our little wooden man has how many components? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 13 pieces of wood into this wooden man. How many ways can you arrange these? Well, over 622 million ways to arrange them. So if you tried them all, and say I could do a new one every few seconds, would take me close to 10,000 years to try every possibility. Chances are there about 5,000 years before I'd get that forming by random chance. And how long would it stand? Until somebody slammed the door and then it would fall apart. So here you go. The second law of thermodynamics. All natural processes tend towards increasing disorder from specified complexity to randomness in all systems, whether open, closed, or isolated, is a fundamental, insurmountable barrier to the theory of evolution. How else can they try to get around it? We try to get around it through what we call the chloroplast gambit. And he appealed to what you mentioned before, that plants can do it. You get the sun's energy coming in, and the chloroplasts in the plant will convert that free energy into usable forms so that life on Earth can proceed. Yes, if you have the chloroplasts. Right. But we're talking about, where did life come from in the first place? Until you have life, until you have plants, you don't have chloroplasts. Mm-hmm. So before that, what was converting the sun's free energy? So if we're back to those 4 essential steps for the theory of evolution, the first one, simple chemicals must spontaneously self-assemble the complex organic molecules. Can't happen. The theory of evolution is already dead in the water. The second step, that the complex organic molecules have to self-assemble in the cell, also can't happen. By the second law of thermodynamics, the theory fails again. This from Sir Arthur Eddington, English physicist, mathematician, astronomer, who wrote the greatest works in astrophysics, provided the first proof for the theory of relativity. He says this: the law that entropy always increases, the second law of thermodynamics, holds, I think, the supreme position among the laws of nature. If someone points out to you that your pet theory of the universe is in disagreement with Maxwell's equations, then so much the worse for Maxwell's equations. If it is found to be contradicted by observation, well, These experimentalists bungle things sometimes. But if your theory is found to be against the second law of thermodynamics, I can give you no hope. There's nothing for it but to collapse in deepest humiliation. So there you go. The most fundamental law of science destroys any attempt at chemical evolution, which in turn destroys any attempt at evolution. We're looking at whether the theory of evolution is possible, even from a purely scientific point of view. To recap at this point, it's helpful to do a recap every once in a while. We saw 4 essential steps for evolution to happen. The first of these would be that simple chemicals, such as carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, hydrogen gas, and so on, must spontaneously self-assemble, come together, into complex, ordered organic molecules, proteins, DNA, and so forth. And then these complex organic molecules have to then self-assemble into a cell structure. And we looked at the laws of science, specifically the second law of thermodynamics, and saw that this is impossible. Now, the second law of thermodynamics may sound complex, but in reality, it's something that we all understand. It simply says that in nature, in natural processes, everything falls apart, everything decays as time goes on. Things don't go in the opposite order. If you have a house, eventually it will fall apart into a pile of rubble, but a pile of rubble will never spontaneously turn into an ordered house. Firewood burns into ash. Ash cannot be burned back into firewood. People get older. They don't get younger. This, as we saw, is the most certain law of all of science, and it prevents these 2 steps, which means the theory of evolution, certainly atheistic evolution, is already impossible. So we'll continue on from here, and we look at the next of the 4 essential steps. We looked at the first 2. The third one is, if we ignore the problems with creating the cell structure, the next problem is it's not alive, and it will have to come to life. Is it possible for a cell structure that's non-living to come to life? What would you think?
So, no, something that isn't alive isn't able to bring something else into life. I think this is called the law of biogenesis.
Indeed. For a long time, people did believe that life could come about spontaneously. It's what they called spontaneous generation. And the reason they thought that is if you left a piece of meat rotting out, eventually you're going to find little bugs developing inside the meat. And they thought that the dead meat had just given rise to these bugs. Some wonderful experimental work done mainly by Louis Pasteur in the 19th century showed that, in fact, spontaneous generation doesn't happen. And he had various experiments. An obvious one on the rotting meat is he put out a piece of rotting meat, and then he put out another piece of rotting meat in a sealed container, cut off from everything. And sure enough, the meat that was just left open had these little bugs developing, and the meat that was cut off in the environment didn't. And they eventually discovered that these bugs were actually hatching fly eggs. Flies would come and deposit their eggs on the meat, and they would then grow into these maggots. These were the little bugs. And in fact, without the flies doing that, you wouldn't get these bugs. So this and other experiments from Pasteur led to what was called the law of biogenesis, enunciated in 1864, which says that only life can give rise to life. Life never comes from non-living matter.
Yeah, sorry, John. Before we continue any further, could we define what life is?
We really can't, actually, because scientists say that life is like art. You can't define it, you just know it when it is. So what they do is they tend to talk about the characteristics of life. It runs metabolic processes, it reproduces, right. There's growth generally. So a constellation of characteristics that define life or describe life is actually better. Okay. But nobody can certainly give you an actual definition of life. But as with art, they can tell when something is alive, something isn't. Okay? Something like a virus, they may say, well, a virus can't exist on its own. So there's a question there, but the reality is, in general, we know. Certainly when we're talking about animals, we're talking about people, we know what's alive, what's not. For example, we could do this simple experiment. Take a frog. Do not try this at home, folks. It's just an illustration. Take a frog, take a blender, insert frog into blender, push the cream button, and guess what you're going to get? You're going to get like frog soup. Inside this frog soup, you have all of those complex organic molecules that you need. You have your proteins, your DNA, your RNA, your lipids, all of that. You don't have to worry about where these come from. They're all there. So make it come to life. Make something come to life out of it. Well, you can't do it. Or even roadkill. You come across a squished raccoon on the road. An hour ago was alive. Make it come back to life. I mean, everything is there. Even the structures are in place. You can't do it. And we know that. So this is the law of biogenesis. And it is a law of science like any other law. And laws tell you what always happens in the same way and under the circumstances, and it's never violated. And this has become a big problem for evolutionists. They kind of wish that the law of biogenesis had never been discovered. And they can actually become very much intellectually dishonest on this. When you bring up the law of biogenesis, the evolutionists will say, well, all that Pasteur did was disprove spontaneous generation. And we're looking for abiogenesis, life coming from non-life, and that's our research is abiogenesis, as if you make up a term and that makes it happen. The problem with this is the law of biogenesis tells you that life only comes from life. Life cannot come from non-living matter. It doesn't apply only to spontaneous generation. There's the proverbial story of Newton discovering the law of gravity when an apple fell out of a tree and landed on his head, and that got him to thinking about this. So what the evolutionists now are doing with the law of biogenesis would be like saying, wow, the law of gravity only applies to apples falling out of trees. It's not an honest way to do science. And to talk about we're doing research into abiogenesis means nothing. It's because it can't be done. We already have the law of science for that. Furthermore, as we talked about when we discussed how science operates, you do the experiment, you try to disprove something, you do it 1,000 times, it's never violated, 2,000 times, it's never violated. By inductive logic, you should conclude that this is the law. It's never going to be violated. That's how science works. Have scientists been working on abiogenesis, on trying to bring life out of non-living matter? Certainly they have. They've done thousands of experiments, trying under the best possible laboratory conditions to make it happen. And every single time they've failed. So by the proper scientific method, they should reconclude the law of biogenesis. It can't happen. But they need it for evolution to work. They need it to drive God out, so they're going to insist we're still looking. This is not proper science, folks.
Yeah, we've mentioned before that if theory violates a law, then we discard it.
Has to go. Now, what you'll often see in the textbooks or hear about in the classroom is what they call the Urey-Miller experiment. Have you heard of that?
Just briefly. Can you tell us more about it?
The Urey-Miller experiment was an experiment into abiogenesis done by two researchers, Harold Urey and Stanley Miller, back in 1953. And what they did here was put together an elaborate set of apparatus that had one glass ball with water in it, the so-called oceanic compartment, and they put a heater under it, a Bunsen burner, so that would heat the water and boil it. The water vapor then went up through a glass tube and into another glass ball, and this was called the atmospheric compartment. So these two balls were supposed to represent the ocean and then the atmosphere of the early Earth. Within the atmospheric compartment, they put in gases, the kind that they thought would have been in the atmosphere of the early Earth. So nitrogen gas, methane, carbon dioxide, nitrogen gas, ammonia, hydrogen gas. And into this, they now put the water vapor from the oceanic compartment and that little electrodes to make sparks. And they were trying to create life because they believed that this is how life came about on early Earth. And so they would spark these, and out would come the products from the atmospheric compartment and nothing. What they did then is they put in a cold water trap. They put in something to instantly cool the products. And now they found a few simple amino acids coming out of it. These would have broken down instantly, except that they were cooled down. So what this whole experiment gave them were a few simple amino acids, not even a simple protein. Remember? This doesn't happen. Not even one simple protein. And yet they said, see, this explains how life came about on early Earth. Now, do you think you could identify a few problems with this claim?
Yeah, well, the first thing would be, what would this cold water, where would you be able to find it in the early Earth?
Yeah,
So,
would there be anything that corresponds to this cold water trap? No, there isn't. So that's one. Mm-hmm. Anything else?
Next is, as you mentioned, these are very simple amino acids, nothing resembling proteins. Another thing is, can all of these organic compounds have been at the right concentration for this to happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. Does this set of organic compounds or these gases in the early atmosphere, would they have been there in those concentrations? In fact, they wouldn't have been there at all. The one that they've left out here is oxygen. And the problem with oxygen is it oxidizes things. So you wouldn't possibly get even these simple amino acids. Anything that came out would instantly be oxidized. So the early models claimed that there was no oxygen in the atmosphere of the early Earth. That didn't develop until green plants came along. But now our studies have shown, by analyzing the components in the earliest structures of the Earth, that in fact oxygen was there from the beginning. So this is a non-starter. Even their atmospheric compartment, we know that the earliest atmosphere was not like that. So it's game over. And then the other obvious problem is you might get a few simple amino acids, but they're not alive. This is supposed to show how life came about. And they will show you in the textbooks and the kids' books, they will show you this. They might mention that, this is just about organic compounds, but then they will say, well, okay, and then they came to life. And that's just absolute nonsense. And the fact that they will continue putting forth the Urey-Miller experiment, although they know it's not accurate and it doesn't explain the origin of life, but this is the one they're always putting forth when they're teaching evolution, origin of life in the classroom. It tells you something. It tells you something about whether they really have answers or not. They don't. They're just extremely desperate here to try to find something. But you always find that. Here's one common or popular book for children called Life. It says, investigate the origins of life and find out how living things survive. And you go inside the book, and how did life begin? Well, you'll have your picture of the Urey-Miller experiment there. And the claims that, we just really don't know. We don't know where it really came from, but we'll find out. And it gets just extremely, extremely desperate from that book. Most scientists believe that the first forms of life were extremely simple and probably appeared through a series of random chemical reactions nearly 4 million years ago. Important evidence for this idea came in 1953 when an American chemist named Stanley Miller carried out a crucial experiment. He constructed a sealed chamber that imitated conditions on the early Earth. When he analyzed the substances that were produced, he discovered several chemical building blocks that are normally made only by living things. So even in that short paragraph, you can now identify at least 4 or 5 things here that are just absolutely not true, but they keep getting fed out. Every book you find for children, this one called Evolution, subtitled How We and All Living Things Came to Be, you look into it, hoping to find out how living things came to be. They never tell you. You have stuff like this. This was published in National Post some years back. Whole new theory on life, with whole spelled H-O-L-E. And they're looking at a Arctic meteor crater, a place where a meteor hit Earth in the Arctic a long time ago. And they found microbes in them. And they're saying, maybe this is how it happened. Now, they admit that the microbes were there all along and they just migrated into this crater. So they're already there and they're already alive. So this doesn't actually tell you how life came about on Earth. Another good example, the physicist Paul Davies, well-known author, popularizer of physics, in his book called The Fifth Miracle, The Search for the Origin and Meaning of Life, he tells us, and this is some descriptive literature for the book, says Davies no longer believes that we're close to wrapping up the mystery of life's origins. We have a good idea of the where and the when, he says, but we are a very long way from comprehending the how. And then it goes on to say his own belief is that the answer will be found in some, quote, profoundly new and amazing theory. So here you have it. They don't understand how it happened because it violates science. There's no scientific way for it to happen. So they now have to hold out for some kind of profoundly new and amazing theory. And theories that violate laws are bogus. So this is pretty much an admission that they're stuck, that they don't have an explanation. They can't have an explanation. So when we look at those 4 essential steps for the theory of evolution, step number 3, the cell must come to life. Well, that one's a failure also and has to be tossed. Now, here's the thing. So you're an atheist, you're backed into a corner. You might say, well, okay, we'll go to deism. We'll say, yeah, sure, there was a God. You couldn't have had these chemicals formed by themselves. You couldn't have them self-assemble into a cell. It couldn't come to life. So, okay, we'll have a God to do those things. And then God's left town. He doesn't care anymore. We don't have to worry about God. We've got that first cell now, and organic evolution takes over from there. Is that possible? Because now we've come to the 4th step that we looked at, which is the DNA coding of this cell must develop vast amounts of qualitatively new genetic data. What we mean by this is, let's suppose you have the first cell. It has this coding in it, the DNA. But a single cell doesn't have a lot of coding in it. A lot for a cell. But when you think about multicellular organisms, you think about things like skin and hair and how they come together in structures. Where's the coding for that? Well, you're going to need more coding. Where does it come from? In Darwin's day, it wasn't much of an issue because in Darwin's day, they simply thought that the cell is a very, very simple thing. They didn't understand how it's built. They didn't understand anything about DNA. They thought essentially it's a bag of Jell-O. And they could see, how sure, why not have a bag of Jell-O come about in a warm primordial pond? But now we know that the cell is actually an extremely complex information processing integrated system. It has information in it. And the old understanding used to be that there are 2 fundamental entities in the world, and the 2 were matter and energy. And everything in the world could be understood as some kind of combination or interaction of matter and energy. But the new understanding is there are actually 3 fundamental entities, or 3 fundamental quantities. There's matter, there's energy, and there's information. Information is not simply a product of matter and energy. And it's actually easy to see that when you look into it. Imagine if you have in your home magnetic letters, right? The little plastic letters with magnets on the back. You can stick them in the fridge door. Kids like to play with them. And you can take a couple dozen of these and put them on your fridge door. And they have a certain amount of matter and they have a certain amount of energy. They don't tell you anything. It's just a bunch of random letters. Now you can take those letters and rearrange them to give you some kind of message. It could say, I am happy today. Has the amount of matter in these letters changed?
No.
The amount of energy?
Nope.
But do they now say something that they didn't say before?
Indeed.
So they are conveying information. And so now the new understanding is, yes, information is a separate quantity. It can't be explained just by interaction of matter and energy. And so they have to explain where the information came from. Point of fact, the information is in the DNA is a lot of it, and very complex. And so the evolutionist has to explain 2 things. He has to explain where the information in the first functioning cell came from. Now, if you're going to go the deist route and say, well, God made it, then you don't have to worry about that part. But you do have to explain, where did you get this increase in qualitative, meaningful information increase from the DNA in the first cell to the DNA in your higher organisms. You have to figure out where that came from. Now, something more about fundamentals of science. When scientists are investigating something that they can't observe in real time, you can't study by proper scientific matter, you are looking at something that happened at one point in the past and it's not repeatable, then what they have to do here is to make what they call the inference to the best explanation. Which, for whatever you're observing, what is the best explanation? And broadly speaking, there are three possible types of phenomena and therefore three possible explanations. And that's really all there is. Because there are certain things that always happen. We could call the probability of that being 1 out of 1. If I drop the pen, it will always fall to the table. I drop the apple, it will always fall. These are things that always happen. They're certain. There are things which never happen. They're impossible. Yeah, I can put the pen on the table. It will never turn curlicues and fly to the moon. The probability there is 0. 0.0 out of 1. And then the third thing is what's in between them. And these are things that sometimes happen, sometimes they don't happen. The possibility of it is greater than 0, less than 1. It could be 50-50, like flipping a coin. These are random. Flip a coin, comes up heads, why'd it come heads? Well, that was one possibility, and it happened to be that one this time. 50, or 0.5 in our scale, chance of that coming heads or tails. Now, some things would be closer to 0. They're much more unlikely. Some things are closer to 1. They're much more likely. If you have, say, Kyle Lowry throwing a free throw, his chance of hitting it will be somewhere around 0.8. You have John Torse throwing a free throw, his chance will somewhere be around like 0.05, much less likely. So these are the three. You have that which always happens, that's certain, that which never happens is impossible, and that which sometimes happens is possible. And these three explanations are designated as necessity, design, and chance. And necessity is the one that always has to happen because there's some law of nature that dictates it, like the apple falling. Well, that's the law of gravity. It has to happen. It's necessity. If it may or may not happen, it's a random event. That's chance. Okay? May happen, may not happen. This time it just happened to happen. And then the third one, if it cannot happen on its own, it can only happen then if some intelligent agent purposely made it happen, and that we call design. So these are the three. When you look at something in the past, for the scientist, he has to make the inference to the best explanation. It has to be necessity, chance, or design. We could illustrate these three. For example, I flip a coin. I flip the coin, it comes down heads. Why did it come down heads? Is it necessity, chance, or design?
Chance.
Generally, you think chance, but suppose I'm one of those crooked gamblers and I have a two-headed coin. Then which one was it?
Then it would be design.
Or it would be necessity. It has to come down. Okay.
Yeah.
The flip is still just flipping, but it has to come down because there's no other option. If I flip it, I want it to come up heads, and I have a regular coin and I flip it and I see it's falling, and it looks like it's going to land on tails, so I poke it with my finger just before it lands and push it over on the heads.
Then you have design.
Another example, you're a homicide detective. You've come to a circus. They had a high wire act, some guy walking way up on a tightrope, and the rope broke as he was walking on it, and he fell to his death. And you have to figure out, was this an accident, just an unfortunate happenstance, or was it murder? So you have to figure out, was it necessity, chance, or design? So you do your investigation and you find that this rope is guaranteed to hold up to 300 pounds. Now the guy's a 200-pound walker, so it should hold him. But so you're a mechanical engineer, you know that...
Things break down over time.
Yeah, things break down over time, and plus your manufacturing process isn't perfect. Every once in a while you get a dud. And he happened to get a dud. It was just chance. It was just a chance, a random event. Very unfortunate. On the other hand, it's rated to hold up to 300 pounds, and you find that the tightrope walker was a 400-pound man. Which is the explanation now?
There's no way it couldn't break. It was a necessity.
Necessity, it had to break, right? Couldn't hold up 400 pounds. Third option, you look at the rope and you notice that it didn't break cleanly. It was somebody had actually cut it 3/4 of the way through. So for sure that 1/4 left couldn't hold him up. Which one is it then?
Somebody purposely cut it, so design.
Design, which means it was murder. So there you go. This is how it operates. And scientists do this all the time. Those famous cave paintings on the wall of a cave that were discovered at Lascaux in France. And people look at it and you see these little paintings of deer and little kind of stick men holding bows and arrows. How did these paintings come about? Necessity, chance, or design? Well, there's no question, is there? How did they come about?
Yeah, somebody obviously drew them.
Yeah. We could say it's necessity. We could say there's some kind of law of nature that makes pigments stick together so they just happen to look exactly like deer and stickmen with bows and arrows. But of course, that would be ridiculous. We could say it's chance. Somebody threw some pigments against the wall and they trickled down and somehow the little bumps in the wall just happen to make them form these patterns that look exactly like deer and stickmen with bows and arrows. And that would be seen as ridiculous. You see even this amount of design in a phenomenon and you know somebody did it. So with that understanding, then we look at this fourth step. Where did the DNA coding come from in the cell? The usual story you hear is that it is, we mentioned this before, natural selection acting on random variation. As DNA mutates, and it can mutate from external factors like radioactivity, or copying errors when the cell's reproducing, but they're not directed, they just happen. This is chance. And if you ask most people about evolution, they think this is what operates it. Natural selection acting on random variation means it's chance. Now, do be aware the evolutionists say, oh, no, it's not chance, you see, because natural selection is based on which gives the organism a better chance to survive, and that's not random. Well, no, that part wouldn't be random. Can chance explain how you could go from molten rock and polymerization up through bacteria and single-celled animals and algae and fungi and dinosaurs and birds and so on up to primates and people? Can random chance explain it? Well, let's look at what's really involved in the cell. As I mentioned, in Darwin's day, it was believed that the cell was a very, very simple thing. It's a bowl of jelly. Things started going south for the theory of evolution when we actually developed the technology to look inside the cell and see what's really there. And it turned out it's really not so simple after all. It's not just a bowl of jelly. Imagine taking the entire city of Los Angeles and convert every part of it into an automated factory. And then micro-miniaturize it until it's so tiny that you can't even see it. That would be pretty complex, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And it's still not as complex as a cell is. So the idea of this coming about by random chance begins to strain credulity. How do the different parts come about? And you get into some really ridiculous ideas. How did a cell get a nucleus? And the structure of a cell, it's sort of like a bag of protoplasm, but it has all of these organelles inside that do things, and most particularly the nucleus. You know about that, the nucleus of a cell. One idea that's floated around is that the first cell with a nucleus may have been a cell that engulfed another cell, which kept on living inside it. So think about that. Any comments?
How could that cell contribute in any way to make this a more advanced cell?
It doesn't even have a nucleus originally, but it's sort of like saying, this is my way of analogy, imagine people have no brains. You wonder how a person will function without a brain, but it's no brain. And then one day he eats a squirrel, he swallows a squirrel, and the squirrel doesn't get digested. I mean, it's in the digestive tract, which is designed to digest it, but somehow the squirrel doesn't get digested. The squirrel actually fuses with the human body, becomes part of the human body, and turns into the brain, and now the human body has a brain. Does that make any sense? If a cell, we have to explain where its DNA came from, and where's the DNA stored if it doesn't have a nucleus, it swallows another cell. Now, why does it swallow another cell? It's meant to eat. It digests cells. So why did it not digest this cell? And if it didn't digest the cell, Some others just had some kind of wall to protect it, and it's just sitting in there. How does it become part of the cell, the other cell, the cell that ate it? Like, none of this makes sense when you think about it. And it underscores how absurd they have to become to maintain this theory so they can get rid of God. So let's look in detail now. Cell, as we said, it's got all of this information. The information is coded using 4 letters. Call these A, C, G, and T, because they stand for the nitrogenous bases in the DNA. Adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine. So A, G, T, A, C, G, and T. And you will have these. Now, four letters, you can only write so much, right? So what they do is each letter for the amino acid is based on a group of 3 of these bases. So you have 3 bases put together to give you 1 letter. Well, now, instead of 4 choices, you have 4 times 4 times 4 choices, 64 choices. So now you can have 64 letters, 64 amino acids. You can write stuff with it. So where does the information come from? Chance, necessity, or design. Those are your only options. Now, the DNA coding is very complex, as we've mentioned. You need to get all of these. They code for the proteins that your body uses. It builds proteins. You eat food. It's broken down. Amino acids are then constructed into the proteins your body needs. And the instructions for how to put the amino acids together in the right order are what's coded in your DNA. Mm-hmm. So this is like a really, really long, almost like a computer program, giving the order using these combination of 3 bases. Can it happen by chance? Well, that's what we're told in school. That's what it's random mutation, chance. But here's the problem. If you have this group of 3, we call it a codon, these 3 bases, and it will give you a code to tell you what amino acid to put in the chain. You have 64 different options, right? Mm-hmm. For your first letter. Okay, now suppose we're coding for something very simple. We're coding for the word cat, which means we need 3 amino acids in the right order. What are the chances of getting C as your first letter? Well, it's 1 in 64. 64 possibilities. What are your chances of getting an A for the second letter? 1 in 64. What are your chances of getting T for the third letter? 1 in 64. So that's already like less than 1 in a quarter of a million just to get 3 letters in the right order. If we want to generate, just by random chance, the sequence the cat came back using the codon system, the chances of that are 1 in 5 times 10 to the 30. And if I know how much 10 to the 30 is, how big is that?
You probably wouldn't even be able to wrap your brain around that.
No, it'd be like 1,000 times a billion times a billion. And you're right, people can't wrap their brains around that because we have no ability really to conceptualize numbers like this. Mm-hmm. The best I can do to try to give you an illustration is, imagine you're counting to 1 million, and you're counting at a rate of 1 per second. You're doing it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. How long would it take you to count up to 1 million? Well, it'd take you about 5.5 days, okay, which is doable. 5.5 days. But now I'm going to ask you to count to 1 billion at the same rate, 1 per second, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Count to 1 billion. Okay, you could count to 1 million in about 5.5 days. How long would it take you to count to 1 billion? Take a guess.
Just multiply 5.5 by 1,000, so 5,500 days.
Yeah, 5,500 days. About 31 years. That's just 1 billion. Try 1 trillion, right? That now be instead of 31 years, it would be 31,000 years. Okay, and that's just 1 trillion. We're talking here about 1,000 times 1 trillion times 1 trillion. And that's just for the cat came back. If we want to generate by random chance, Shakespeare's line, to be or not to be, that is the question. We're talking about 2.76 times 10 to the 70. So it's one with like 70 zeros after it. Now, there is some overlap, okay, because there's only about 20 different amino acids that proteins need. So there's some overlap, and 3 different groupings could give you the same amino acid. But even if we factor that in, the chance to get something like to be or not to be, that is the question, is 6.8 times 10 to the 51. Okay, 51 would be what? a billion times 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 a billion, right? Something like that. And this is just for to be or not to be. That is a question. That's not a lot of information. In the human genome, there's over 3 billion bits of information. To generate, by random chance nursery rhyme, Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. With the redundancy is 1 in 10 to the 156, okay, which is well beyond what scientists consider to be the universal probability bound. This means it's well beyond what scientists accept as impossible. It just can't happen. So sometimes you hear like what they call the infinite monkey theorem. If you have an infinite number of monkeys pounding on an infinite number of typewriters across infinite time, one of them will eventually crank out all the works of Shakespeare. And that's actually true, except that we don't have infinite monkeys or infinite typewriters or infinite time. Like any one of those would be enough, but we don't have them and we can't have them. Remember what we said before about the infinite staircase? Mm-hmm. And heat, death of the universe. So the infinite monkey theorem sounds nice, but it's not possible. You don't have infinite of any of these. At most, you have to go with what's called the probabilistic resources of the universe, how many atoms there are in the universe, how fast you could try new combinations, how much time you had. Even if you assume that the world is like 20 billion years old, your universal probability bound would come to like 10 into 150. And we saw even for the Jack and Jill nursery rhyme, the chances are smaller than that. So what that means is the idea that the information in DNA was produced by random chance is absolutely impossible. Absolutely impossible. And here is the trade secret in origin of life studies. In the schools, they'll still tell you, sure, natural selection acting on random mutation. You'll still see that in Time magazine. You'll still see that on Nature Channel. But internally, origin of life scientists have long since given up on random chance. They've done these mathematical calculations, these combinatorics. They know it's impossible. So while they may say that to the general public, internally, they are not looking at chance. They know that that's gone. And remember, you had only chance, necessity, and design. Right. And if chance is gone, what are you left with? You're left with necessity and you're left with design. Mm-hmm. Design is, remember, what is design?
Somebody purposely made it.
Exactly. It wouldn't happen unless an intelligence made it. So design means you're admitting God. That's the one they don't want to do. The only one they're left with then is necessity. There has to be some kind of law of nature that makes these codons assemble properly, makes the bases come together in the right order to give you information. It's got to be some kind of law of nature to explain it. It's got to be necessity. We've got to find some way. And that's where all of the origin of life studies are focusing now. Okay, where can we find such a law? Do you think they will ever find such a law?
I do believe that God did design this. So, and based on what we said before, I don't think so, no.
Yeah. Is it even possible? It isn't. And I'll tell you why. And this is the problem. You're down to necessity or design, and they're going to try to go to necessity. They're going to try to find a law of nature to explain how the codons come together. And the problem with that is, as we've seen, laws of nature are always regular. That's what makes them laws. They always do the same thing in the same way. Mm-hmm. Okay, you can build crystal structures. We saw you got the sodium stuck to the chlorine, stuck to the sodium, stuck to the chlorine. You've got that lovely little crystal. But as we said at the time, this is not information. This is just symmetric redundancy, a repeating pattern. And DNA, information, is not just a repeating pattern. The nucleotides, these base pairs have to line up in the right order to give you the information, the recipe to build the protein. And they're different for every one of them. They're asymmetric. It's not just the same pattern over and over again. Each protein has to have its own pattern, which is different from other patterns. And without that, you don't have meaning. It's like an English sentence. You can't just stick one letter to another letter to another letter. They have to be done in the right way. Yeah. So let's suppose that out of our A, T, C, and G. Let's suppose our origin of life scientists did find some law explaining why A, adenine, is attracted to T, thymine. Okay? They found a law that says, yep, A is attracted to T. All right. So you get an A and a T gets attracted to it. What's going to get attracted then to that A, to that T there?
Another A.
Another A. And then to that?
T.
And then to that?
A.
And to that?
T.
Yeah, that's just, you just get AT, like the sodium chloride, sodium chloride, sodium chloride. That's not information. A law, because a law by definition always does the same thing in the same way, can only ever give you this kind of redundancy. It cannot give you information. Which means now, necessity is out. So chance doesn't work, and necessity doesn't work. What's the only thing left? Design. Which, once again, we have shown that, and science, okay, we're not even looking at the Bible right now. The science of the situation has shown that the information, so even if you go the deist route and say, okay, we'll give you, there must be a God to create the first cell, but evolution takes over from there. We've seen it can't, because there's no way. If you have that original cell with its DNA, it needs all of these vast quantities of new DNA, and we've seen that the only explanation, the only way that works to get that is design. Okay, so there you go. You're left with design. Another way to illustrate the impossibility of this view is to realize, as we've mentioned, as Bill Gates said, DNA is like computer code. It's like a computer program, though far more complex than anything we've ever been able to do. Okay, now, have you done coding, Jason?
Yep. Lines and lines and lines of coding.
What language?
I've used C, Python, MATLAB.
You're a young man there. my day was Fortran and
yes.
BASIC. Yeah, my day, when they first brought out I was there when they first brought out home computers, and people would buy these Commodore VIC-20s and Commodore 64s, and there wasn't a lot of off-the-shelf software. You wrote your own programs in BASIC. It's got stuff for beginners, all-purpose symbolic instruction code, and actually wrote all of the software to crunch all of my data for my engineering thesis. I did it on a Commodore 64.
How long did that take to crunch?
I don't remember, but this is a Commodore 64 at 64K of internal memory. Okay? Not M, not G,
Right.
Ks.
Yep.
And you could only use 39 of them because the rest was eaten up by the operating system. But this was the early days of computing. And the very first computer game was called Pong. I don't know if you've seen it. It's kind of made a comeback, a nostalgic comeback. But it's very, very, very simple. What you had basically is you had two vertical lines at each side, and you could move those up and down. And there would be what was actually a square. That's supposed to be the ball, but it was a square. And the ball would be coming towards you, and you move that vertical line up. It's supposed to be your paddle. And if you can get it in the way of the square would then bounce off your paddle and bounce off the wall, and then the guy on the other side would have to move his paddle, and so on. So that was, wow, computer game. But if you look at the graphics, you would see like two vertical lines, one at the top, the bottom, a dotted line of squares down the middle, these two rectangular lines, one at each end, and your ball, which was a square. That was it. That was the graphics. If you get a more modern computer game, you've seen graphics for modern computer games, right?
Yeah, they're really impressive these days.
Yeah, how do you think it would compare to the graphics for Pong?
I know games these days take like tens of gigabytes of storage.
And they can look really real.
Yeah.
I saw this clip on YouTube from I thought it was from a movie. It looked so real. Yeah. I was looking at, what movie is this from? I was trying to track it down. It's not from a movie. It's from a video game. And it looked so real. Yeah. Now, but Pong is just, as I say, it's a couple of vertical lines, a couple of horizontal lines, and a block. So you can imagine the coding, okay, for Pong. It wouldn't be like the coding that you were talking about. So you take this computer program, and you tell me, having done programming, what happens to computer program if you make random changes? If you like just randomly rub out a line here and just randomly insert letters into that line, what happens to the program?
Yeah, it turns into garbage. Even a single tiny mistake or error can ruin your entire code.
It could. It may not. Maybe it'll just hurt the functionality But yeah, it could just crash the entire program. Okay, we know when you make random changes to information, you don't get better information that does new things. Coding is something that requires intelligence to very carefully, well thought out things to create new functionality. The idea that you can randomly change letters in DNA and get new functionality is like randomly changing lines of code in a computer program and expecting it to do new things. Is that possible? Of course not. And they know it's not possible. They know it can't be done, and yet they're still trying to tell you that this is how it happened. They'll tell you that externally. Inside, as I said, they know chance doesn't work. But that's what they'll be telling you, and you can know already. Okay? You don't need to know the mathematics. If you know anything about computer programs, you know that you cannot arbitrarily change parts, arbitrarily substitute things in a random and expect better functionality. You're going to get a program that just doesn't work. So when you think about it, you realize this is what the evolutionists are trying to sell you. DNA is a program, and yeah, you can randomly change things, and it's going to get better. That's ridiculous. So I say, well, but sometimes, copying errors. It copies the entire gene or subunit of a gene, and so you see that's where you get the new information from. But that's like saying, okay, I got a page of information in a book. I'm going to do a photocopy of it. Do I have more information now? What do I have?
The same.
I have 2 copies of the same information. So that's not going to give it to you either. And at some point you have to wonder, do they know this? And they're hoping you don't? Because either way, it's not acceptable. But let's come at it yet another way. Okay, the letter substitution game. Kids like to play this, so I'm used to anyway. You start with one word, and you get clues where you change one letter, and it'll give you a new word. And the clue tells you what letter to change. And in doing so, you can go all the way from one word to a completely different word. In this example, you start with the word bell, and it's going to turn into the word star, simply by changing one letter at a time. But at each point, the new word has to make sense. So the first clue is exchange for money. So bell, you change the B for an S. It becomes sell. Next clue, aquatic pinniped. Well, that's a seal. So you take that first, I'll change it to an A. You get the word seal. Next clue, to char the surface with intense heat. Well, you change that last L to an R and you have sear. And then celestial ball of burning gas. Well, take that E, change it to a T, and you've got star. So you have 4 letters. Randomly, you could change each one. If you change it by random, you have 25 possibilities for each one. If you do it randomly. 25, so it's 309,625 different possibilities. So to go from bell to star by random chance, it's going to be 1 in 9 times 10 to the 21. Okay? How big is that? It's the equivalent to winning Lotto 649 100 times every single day for 270 million years. That's by random chance. But you saw by intelligence, we can do it in about 20 seconds. An intelligent entity can do it. Random chance can't. What do evolutionists try to do to get around this problem? Well, often they'll go to the it happens all the time gambit. Let's say grab 2 decks of distinguishable cards, shuffle them together, lay them out for a game of spider solitaire. What's the probability of that particular lay of cards? And it says, oh, it's 1 in 10 to the 166. That's below the realms of universal probability bound. Oh, so how did that unlikely thing happen? I mean, did God arrange your cards every time you laid out? And this might stumble. Christians at this point say, oh yeah, that makes sense. So unlikely things do happen all the time. But the thing is, it's not an issue of simply being unlikely. It's being unlikely and meaningful.
Right, yeah.
Okay? I can take my computer code and change every single letter randomly. You know, what I'll end up with is just as unlikely. But it's not going to mean anything. Again, illustrate. Not suggesting to play Lotto 649, but this person has played Lotto 649. And the winning numbers are 7, 13, 27, 33, 42, 49. And the odds of getting this is 1 in 10 billion. You picked 2, 18, 22, 31, 39, 40. You didn't get one number right. What are your chances of getting those 6 numbers by random chance? It's still 1 in 10 billion. Yeah. Could you imagine going to the law booth and saying, give me my prize money? And the other side says, wow, those numbers don't mean anything. That's not the winning pattern. But this is 1 in 10 billion odds of getting it. I should get the prize. You're not going to get the prize because it's not enough to be unlikely. It has to be unlikely and meaningful. DNA is meaningful. It actually codes for proteins. So design is indicated when you get something that's extremely unlikely, but is meaningful. That's what information is. That's what you have in the DNA. That's what we're trying to explain. And that's what can't happen. Where I've seen chance is impossible. Necessity, as we've explained, because laws always do the same thing the same way. Necessity won't explain it. All you're left with then is design. How do evolutionists now respond to this? They will go with your old Sergeant Schultz routine. I know nothing. I see nothing. I hear nothing. Don't bother me with the facts. Evolution is true. Okay? Rule number 1, evolution is true. Evolution happened. Rule number 2, if evolution is scientifically impossible, forget science, evolution happened. So let's do a quick recap of what we've covered so far. Do you think you can give us a recap, Jason?
Yeah. So first we went over biblical creation and evolution. We talked about how only one of the two can be true. We then talked about what a theory is and what a law is, and that any theory that violates a law should be discarded. Yeah, we went over the second law of thermodynamics. We saw that the theory of evolution, we can't have spontaneous self-assembly of complex ordered structures because of the second law of thermodynamics. We also talked about the law of biogenesis and how life can only give rise to life, and the theory of evolution depends on abiogenesis, which clearly, based on the name, violates the law of biogenesis. We also went over DNA and talked about chance, necessity, or design. And we've concluded that the information in DNA can only be meaningful by design.
Right. So I'll ask you, and once again, you're finishing your master's in engineering, so you know science. I don't know if you've looked in detail at this kind of stuff before, but as we've gone through it, what is your assessment? Is there something wrong with what I'm saying, or is this comporting with science correctly?
Yeah, I mean, the more I hear what you have to say, John, the more, it's extremely difficult to believe in the theory of evolution. I think what you're saying tracks.
And here's, I think, where big problem for the churches is that they often don't have people who know the science well. And so when they hear that science proves evolution or proves elements of the theory, they don't feel equipped to challenge it, and so they go along. And what they know is the Bible, so that they can then try to twist, and it's very, very harmful. The science does not support the theory of evolution. Now, we've looked at hard laws of science. There's still more things to look at. For example, the supposed evidence that's given for the theory of evolution. So there's a lot more interesting stuff still to come on this. And I think by the time we're finished, it'll become very, very clear that the only viable explanation for why we're here is the God of the Bible. So we've been talking about the fact that even if you had a cell, even if it came to life, you would not be able to get the new genetic information that is needed to go from a single cell up to the many different types of life forms we have. If you consider dogs, for example, you look at dogs and you see there's a huge variety among them, from gigantic Great Danes all the way down to tiny Chihuahuas. Huge difference in size, in coloration, in ear shape, and so on. Type of hair, Labradors, your German Shepherds, Dachshunds, Huskies, and so on. Very many different types. But by studying genetics, scientists have discovered that all of the types of dogs we have today, including modern wolves and jackals and so on, and all of our domestic dogs, all descended from one original ancestor, which would have been some kind of wolf-like animal. And from that, we got all of these different types. But how we got them is selective breeding, which means we would isolate populations of dogs. Suppose you want big dogs. Okay? You want dogs to do work for you, shepherd dogs, guard dogs. You want them to be big. You want them to be tough. So you take a big dog, tough dog, you mate it with another big dog, tough dog. If they, in their litter, they have a small dog, you discard that one, move it away. You only allow the big ones with the big ones, the tough ones with the tough ones. And eventually your little population subset of dogs will be only the big tough ones. There will be no longer small ones in there. You can do the same thing with the type of hair you want on the dogs, curly hair for poodles, and so on. You can do it for color. And you'll notice that dog breeders are very obsessed with what they call purebreds. Because if you have poodles, for example, you breed poodles with poodles, you just get poodles, because that's all the genetic potential they have. And these people are obsessed with making sure that their purebred dogs don't mate with another type of dog, because then those genetic features that you've so carefully bred out of the population will come back in. That's why they're so careful to make sure they don't breed with each other. Because what's happened with poodles, with Great Danes, with dachshunds, is they have lost a lot of the genetic potential that was in the original population, simply by isolating them and breeding them together in such a way that the same traits are favored. And this is artificial. It's done by human breeders. We call it selective breeding. The same thing can happen in nature. If you get a population of animals that get isolated in one particular location, one particular climate, certain traits will come to the fore. Bears, for example, why are bears around the North Pole, why are they white? Well, because that suits them a lot better. In the snow, the white background, it's harder for their prey to see them. So this is what's called selective breeding. But the thing to notice that in every case, you start with a population, you isolate a subset of the population, and that subset loses some genetic potential. And that brings different features to the fore, the phenotype, the thing you see. But the genes have become impoverished. Now, for Darwinian evolution to work, you need the opposite. You need qualitatively new genetic data to come about. Simply isolating a population and losing traits isn't going to do it. If you're going to, for example, believe that a reptile evolved into a bird, well, birds have all kinds of features reptiles don't. So you can't simply take a group of reptiles, isolate them, have them lose some potential, and suddenly develop the traits of a bird. It has to come. There has to be some source to get this new genetic data, and there isn't any. And interestingly enough, and this is the fun thing, I don't read just things from creationists. I read both sides. That's the way you're going to get the full picture. And when you read the evolution side, actually, you become more convinced of creationism because you see the things that they're dishonest about. This book, for example, called The Triumph of Evolution and the Failure of Creationism, written some years back by a fellow called Niles Eldredge. And Niles Eldredge at the time was one of the best-known popularizers of evolutionary theory. He was a worker along with Stephen Jay Gould, and they came up with the punctuated equilibrium model of evolution. So he writes this book, and he poses himself as some sort of Latter-day Cincinnatus. He really just doesn't want to get involved, but he has to, because there are these pernicious creationists coming out. And so Eldredge has to put them in their place. So he writes this book trying to show why evolution is true. And he gets to this very, very problem we're dealing with. Where do you get the new genetic information from? He goes through several pages explaining how species develop. And he says exactly what we described, how you isolate, you partition the population into subgroups, and there, some of them will lose some genetic information. It's what's called gene flow, and eventually they will look different. Now, here's the part that I want you to pay attention to. He writes this: "Could this simple process also account for all the changes among the larger groups of animals and plants, between, say, reptiles and mammals? In principle, the evolution of a family should be no different in its basic nature and should involve no different processes. QED. If adaptive modification within species explains the evolutionary differences between species within a genus, logically, it must explain all the evolutionary change we see between families, orders, classes, phyla, and the kingdoms of life. This is what Niles Eldredge writes. Now, do you see a problem there?
Yeah, the adaptive modification within species, they happen because there is a loss of genetic potential, but I don't see how he can logically then reason to say that this can explain all the different evolutionary changes we see between all these families, orders, classes, phyla, and kingdoms of life.
Yeah, exactly. He's just admitted that you get new species by starting with a certain amount of genetic data and losing some of it in subsets. And then he says, oh, logically it would happen the same way to go to families, orders, classes. Well, no, because those require new data. It's the exact opposite process of speciation, of getting new species. And it's very strange to me that he would say this because it's not logical. It's the opposite. It's sort of like saying, well, if you lose data, if you lose capability, you'll get something new eventually. It's like saying if I take my laptop and I smash it with a hammer and smash it enough times, it'll eventually turn into an F-15 fighter jet. Like, it just makes no sense. And these people know the science well enough that it's very difficult to think that they don't see the problem here. So, as we've said, there's this fourth essential step for the theory of evolution. The DNA coding of the cell must develop vast amounts of qualitatively new genetic data, meaningful data. It can't happen, not by any natural process. And so the theory of evolution, for the fourth time now, shows itself to be impossible. It's a failure. We can also point this out, okay? Design, evidence of design. I saw this newspaper article headlined, Prehistoric Spearhead Discovered on New Brunswick Coast. Woman wore ancient artifact as a talisman years before it drew scientists' attention. Now, it's a sharpened piece of rock, and it's got kind of flakes off the sides of it. You can see somebody took a tool and knocked it pieces off the rock to bring it to a sharp point, sharp edges. Okay? So you can see obvious evidences that somebody worked at this to make it into a spearhead. Now, there's not a lot of evidence of design here. It doesn't look all that different from a sharp outcrop of rock you might come across on a mountainside. But the fact that you get those little flake marks at the side tells you this was designed. And this is the strange thing. When you get that much design on a sharp piece of rock, you get that much design of some flake marks on the side, the scientists will tell you, yep, that did not come about by random natural processes. It came about by design. Somebody made it happen. A sharp piece of rock with a few flake marks. But when they come to the cell, which, as we pointed out before, is more complex than the entire city of Los Angeles turned into an automated factory and micro-miniaturized, and by the way, is alive, and they say, no design there. Don't see design there. That came about by random natural processes. Does that make any sense?
It's quite the contrast in how they would come to completely different conclusions.
It is. It's what's called a double standard, and it's not justified. Or consider a picture here shows a Cray supercomputer and an operator holding a notebook beside it and standing on this nice floor of marble tiles. Now, the Cray supercomputer is the most sophisticated computing machine ever built by man. Now, if somebody came in and said that, oh, look at that supercomputer there, it wasn't designed. It was assembled by random chance. Somehow those silicon chips just fell together and built the Cray supercomputer. What would we say about such a person?
Cray.
Pretty much, yes, we would say that. It's a non-starter. Nobody would think that or say that. But again, we look at this picture, and if I were to ask, what is the most sophisticated computing machine, computing device in this picture, what is it?
Yeah, it's actually the person himself.
It's the
brain.
human brain. Exactly. It's far more sophisticated than the Cray supercomputer. And it's not even just the brain. We might look at this later, but consider the human eye. The human eye does signal processing on the light coming into it, even before it gets to the brain. And it would take a minimum of 100 years of Cray supercomputing time to emulate what happens in the human eye many times every single second. That's how far ahead the human being is compared to anything we've built. And yet these people with straight face will say, oh no, you suggest that Cray supercomputer assembled itself? They would say you're crazy. Even the nice marble tiled floor, they say, that couldn't have come about by random natural processes. Look at the design. It had to have been designed. But they'll look at the human being and say, nope, random natural processes. Does that make sense? Or are we beginning to see the truth of what Professor Larson said, that the theory of evolution is about pushing out God? It has never been about science, folks. It has always been about pushing out God. And it's exactly what we see in the Bible. We see it in the Bible. Romans 1:18-22 says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness." It's not that they don't know it. They know it, but they suppress it. They cover it up. They don't want people to know about it. And that's exactly what's happening, exactly what the Bible said. Because what may be known of God is manifest among them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. So when we look at the universe and the people in it and the animals in it, we look at the things that are made, and we say it has to be a God. There's no other explanation. We look at this, God must be powerful. He is God. So as it says, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. People say, well, I believe in evolution. I don't believe in God. They will not have an excuse on Judgment Day when they stand before God. As verse 21 says, because although they knew God, they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. That's what the Bible says. So, and that's exactly what's happening here. And that's 70%, we mentioned 70 to 90% of professing Christian young people who fall away from their faith within 6 months of entering university. It's Hosea 4:6 right there. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. They are misled by these professors. They're paying them big money to hear them. They look like they're very smart. And the churches have not equipped them on this. They have not taught them these things so that they would know, and they would spot the lies, and they would laugh at them, and they would not be taken in. The churches need to be teaching this stuff. 2 Peter 1:5 says, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge. And then it has a whole long list of things after that. But you see, knowledge is up there. You want to be grounded in the faith, you need to know things. That's why churches need to teach these things. Any comments, Jason?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, even when I became a Christian and asked about evolution and creationism, I didn't get to hear too much about it. I was left to my own devices. So now I'm curious about, what are the actual evidences for evolution? Why do so many people believe it then, if we've gone over why it can't be true?
Well, honestly, most people believe it because that's what they've heard. Most people have heard about evolution. They hear about it everywhere they look, from the schools to the media to television. Many people don't even know that there's another side to the story. They don't even know there are people who don't believe it. To them, it's just, this is a fact, like the earth is round. And they don't believe it's a fact because they've ever looked at evidence or even been presented evidence. They just believe it by default. Now, there are certain things that are supposed to be evidence. And sometimes you ask people, why do they believe this? what is the evidence there? And they say, there's a lot of evidence. But you ask them, okay, what is the evidence? Start listing it. And what things would come up? What do you think would be the first that would come up?
Yeah, a big thing would be the fossil record.
Fossil record.
I hear a lot of more similarities in DNA. Yeah, different arguments for the age of the universe, like stars, for example, or carbon dating. Yeah, stuff like that.
Yeah, I think you fit most of them right there. There's the fossil record, and particularly the so-called hominids, the ones that are ape men. They're supposed to be ancestors of human beings. There's claims of the age of the earth, that it's much older than the Bible says. Now understand, that in and of itself doesn't prove evolution, but it is a necessary condition for it, or at least they feel it's a necessary condition. Yeah. And so they will bring up things like, well, we know the earth is ancient, we know it from carbon dating, or more properly, radiometric dating. But then you ask them, okay, what is radiometric dating and how does it work? And most people at that point are stuck. They have no idea. And then you ask them, how does this prove the earth is ancient? They don't know. They've just heard it. I saw one person, and kind of sad to say, he was from University of Toronto, who said, well, science is whatever scientists say. Evolution must be true because the scientists say so. Yeah, there are claims about similarity in DNA. You probably heard the claim that the DNA of the chimpanzee and the DNA of the human being are 98% identical or 98.5% identical. One of the ones that's commonly brought up are examples of evolution happening now. The peppered moth is one of their favorites. There's the argument from unintelligent design. They will say that, well, if you look at the human body, it's actually not optimally designed. It's suboptimal. We could do better. And so this kind of suboptimal design makes more sense if it just came about randomly rather than by supreme intelligence doing it. You might hear homology, the similar structures. So it's the phenotypical version of the DNA argument that, oh, look at the arm of a human and the wing of a bat, look at the similarities. So these are all things that are brought up as evidences for evolution, and we will look at all of them. But before we do that, remember the story of the murder of John Doe? Remember we took you through that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the point there was that even if you have certain supposed evidence for a conclusion, if other facts make that conclusion impossible, then that conclusion is not true. The evidence consistent with it can fit into other models. But if it's impossible, then it can't have happened. Another quick illustration, we have 4 people who could have committed the murder, and you find out that the victim was shot by a left-handed man. You know he's left-handed, and George over there is left-handed, so he's the killer, right? Well, if he's the only left-handed man, sure. But what if Tom, Dick, and Harry are also left-handed? Mm-hmm. That's what's happening here. They're saying, oh, look, these facts for evolution are like saying that George is left-handed, and they don't realize there are other models that these would also fit into, which are possible. But evolution, as we've already seen, is impossible. So with that fact in mind, let's move on to the supposed evidence, and we'll start with the fossil record. That's the one that usually comes up, and we start by identifying what is a fossil. What would you say is a fossil? What's your working definition there, Jason?
Well, a fossil, scientifically, is a partially or fully mineralized remnant of an organism from the past, or, in other words, the imprint of an organism preserved in sedimentary rock.
Yeah, that's what a fossil is. So what does it mean by partially or fully mineralized? Well, what they mean is that an animal dies and its flesh rots away and the bones are left, and the bones are buried in sediments, and there are minerals in the sediments, and through the years these minerals start seeping into the bone and replace the bone until you're left with what is essentially a piece of rock that looks just like the bone. That's what I mean by fossilized. How do fossils form? Well, most kids will tell you. Okay, some animal dies, and it's covered by sediments. The flesh, as we said, the flesh decays away. The soft tissues are gone because they don't last long. But the hard elements, the skull, the rest of the skeleton, the teeth, they remain. And very, very slowly, layers of sediment will begin to accumulate above the remains. And eventually, more and more layers are on top of the skeleton, and the weight begins to squeeze it together. And minerals from the seawater or whatever other source is meanwhile seeping into the bone and mineralizing them. And eventually the skeleton is replaced by a rock equivalent, fully or partially rock equivalent. And it's just there until eventually erosion might uncover it, or people digging find it, and there you go. And it's obviously a very, very slow process, because we're told that it takes a very long time for these layers of sediment to cover the skeleton. I remember seeing a kid's science book in a store the other day that's meant to teach them science, and the title was something catchy like, "How do I fossilize my pet hamster?" So the instruction was, well, take your hamster, take 1,000,000 years, and so on, right? It takes a lot of time. The biblical view is different. The biblical view says that fossils form very quickly. Most of them, not all, but most of them actually trace back to the flood, because to get fossils, as we said, you need to have the dead animal. It needs to be covered quickly by layers of sediment and have access to water, something that's carrying minerals in it. And if you have all those elements, you can get fossils. And they would say that during the time of a worldwide flood, which could be anywhere from 2,500 BC to as far back as 3,346 BC, you had the entire world covered with water. And of course, the land masses and these big storms and displacements would have huge, huge quantities of sediments flowing all around. The animals die, they get covered quickly, and quickly turn into fossils. It doesn't take millions of years. And at this point, people will poo-poo them, because they'll say, oh, of course it takes millions of years. And then the question is, well, how do you know? I mean, did you ever bury bones and leave them for 1,000,000 years and come back to look at them? Well, no, of course not. The reality is, you can, and we have done this in the lab, you can fossilize chicken bones, for example, in 5 to 10 years. It doesn't take millions of years. There's actually some fun examples of rapidly forming fossils. In New Zealand, there's a volcano, Mount Tarawera, that erupted in the year 1886. And stuff oozed out, volcanic ash. It covered some people's encampments. And they dug it up 60 years later. 60 years later, you know what they found there? They found a fully mineralized bowler hat turned to rock, fossilized. Found petrified or fossilized ham, fossilized bag of flour. And these things fossilized within 60 years. So when we look at the official version, it actually doesn't make sense. Okay? Because if an animal dies and it's sitting there on the sea bottom or on the ground, it doesn't stay there for millions of years to get fossilized. Scavengers eat it, bacterial breakdown. Even the skeleton won't stay together. It's pulled apart by the various scavengers. Some of them will actually break the bones to get to the marrow on the inside. So that model doesn't even seem to make sense, whereas the flood model works perfectly. It has all of the ingredients, all of the elements you need to form fossils. They're all right there. Now, this is the first issue. It doesn't take millions of years to make fossils. But to go on the offense, the problem we have with fossils is they don't show what the theory of evolution requires. What should we see in the fossil record if evolution happened? Well, Charles Darwin himself, in his own book, The Origin of Species, chapter 14, tells us what sort of fossils are needed to support the theory of evolution. He says this is what we should find: an infinitude of connecting links between the living and extinct inhabitants of the world, and at each successive period between the extinct and still older species. This would afford plain evidence of the gradation and mutation of the forms of life. What does he mean by that? Well, imagine you have a reptile, snake, and we're told that these reptiles have, through millions of years, evolved into birds. Let's take just one feature, the skin covering. The snake has scales, and the scales are essentially they're folds in the skin. The bird is covered with feathers, and the feathers are very carefully structured item that actually sits inside pores in the skin. It's actually not part of the skin like scales are. And it has these very tiny hair-like structures coming out of the side, which if you look at very closely, it's a very detailed, carefully designed connection of hooks and barbs along a central shaft and barbules. And the point of it is to make it aerodynamic. So you flap it, you get the maximum lift. Now, if snakes evolved into birds, or say lizards evolved into birds, you would have had to go from a skin covering of scales to a skin covering of feathers. Now, this couldn't happen in one step. There's so many differences. So what you should find in the fossil record, if this is true, is these connecting links Darwin spoke about. You would have to have lizards or snakes that have scales on as their skin covering. And then somewhere along the line, you're going to have some kind of animal that has a skin covering, has a fold in the skin, but somehow has some kind of hook or barbule, something that's 99% scale, but not quite a scale. There's a little difference that makes it 1% feather. And as you go forward, you'd have to have animals that have skin coverings that are like 98% scale, 2% feather, and keep going until you get up to like 75% scale, 25% feather. We get 50% scale, 50% feather, and then upwards until 25% scale, 75% feather, and so on until it's feathers. So this is what a genuine connecting link, or what we call intermediate form, is. It's an animal that has some kind of structures, organ systems that are midway between two finished versions. That's what we need. Something like an animal, as I say, with skin covering that's 50% scale, 50% feather. They try to point to supposed feathered dinosaurs and they say these are intermediates, but they're really not, because if these dinosaurs had feathers, they're fully formed, fully functional feathers. Where is the intermediate form? Mm-hmm. Where's the dinosaur that has skin covering that's 50% scale, 50% feather? I don't mean half of it is covered with scales and half covered with feathers. I mean every piece of the skin covering has to itself be structurally 50% scale, 50% feather.
Right.
Those would be genuine intermediate form. And there is not one of those. Not one anywhere have we found.
And also those scale feathers would also have to give some kind of advantage for the animal in order for it to be passed down, if this was really the case.
Exactly. Yeah. To maintain this in the population, it would have to give a benefit to survival, the so-called survival of the fittest. But if you think about it, you have lizards, their legs are fully functional. They're great for scampering around here and there. Birds have wings, and they're great for flying. What happens when you have a structure that's like 50% leg and a 50% wing? Well, you can't fly with it yet. Yeah. You're not going to be able to run nearly as well with something that's like your legs are halfway wings. What's going to happen? Well, the predators will eat you, and you're not going to pass on those mutations anymore.
Right, yeah.
Right? What they do is they point to animals that have features of more than one thing, and we'll look at some of these later. But just for now, I can tell you, these are not intermediate forms. A genuine intermediate form has structures, organ systems that are partway between finished, fully functional forms. If the parts are all fully functional, it's not an intermediate form. And you will see when they give you examples, they will always be these kinds that have fully finished, fully functional forms, and they will tell you these are intermediates, and they really aren't. Take, for example, your duck-billed platypus. Very weird kind of animal, which maybe God created just for this purpose. Because you look at the duck-billed platypus, its bill looks like the bill of a duck, hence duck-billed platypus. But the tail is like the tail of a beaver. Its feet are like the feet of an otter. The fur is most similar to bear's fur. It has a poison gland, and it's oviparous. That means it lays eggs. So it's very, very different from any other kind of animal. But nobody suggests that the duck-billed platypus is an intermediate between duck and bear, or between duck and beaver. Has all these weird features, but all of them are fully functional, fully finished, fully there. So this is the thing. We do not have, and we have not found transitional forms. Okay? If you go back down into the Earth's crust, you go to the oldest level, supposed oldest levels of the Earth's crust, you find nothing until you get to the level called the Cambrian level of rock, and you get what's called the Cambrian explosion. And suddenly in the Cambrian level, you have billions of fossils there, and they're all of highly complex forms of life that don't have any ancestors anywhere in the fossil record. So supposedly, going from a single cell to these animals would have taken billions of years, and yet we've got nothing. How come no fossils of intermediate forms have remained? Now, it should be noted that Darwin did say this is the biggest of the objections that could be raised against his theory. But he said, I think the answer is in the paucity of the fossil record. We just haven't found a lot yet. And he said, just, give us time. We'll find them. Okay? We will find them as we dig up more fossils. Well, perhaps he could have gotten away with that in 1859. But we've now gone more than 160 years then. We have found, literally, billions of fossils. Billions of them, and we have not found one genuine intermediate form. Not one. And now statistically, you should have more intermediate forms than you have final forms, and we've not found one. Okay? That's a problem. It supposedly took 100 million years for a fish to evolve from an invertebrate, and there must have been hundreds of thousands of intermediate forms between an invertebrate and a fish, and yet we have not one transitional form, not one of these intermediates. Supposedly 50 million years for this fish then to evolve into an amphibian, but again, not one genuine transitional form. Not one single fossil that has something that's part fin, part feet. Nothing. And that's true between every major plant and animal kind. They just appear in the fossil record, and they're in the fossil record. They may disappear. If they've gone extinct, they may still be there, but no intermediate forms.
Interesting.
Now, of course, the evolutionists will try to get around that. They'll say, we do have intermediate forms. Now, remember, a genuine intermediate form has incomplete structures, organ systems, partway between the two finished forms. They have nothing like that. And what they do offer is very much desperate gambits that fail in the end. They will try to tell you that whales evolved from land animals. And they will point to a few fossils that are supposedly walking whales. Now you might ask, how do we know that these are ancestors of whales? They're essentially just fossils that you dug out of the ground. Well, they claim they are. You've got the ambulocetus, which really just means walking whale. And this was supposed to be a transitional form between other ancestors of the whales, the Pachycetus and the Rhodocetus. Now, an evolutionist who was researching this fossil said that there are 8 characteristics that show that Ambulocetus was a whale ancestor. His key piece of evidence was a certain bone in the ear, the so-called sigmoid process, which supposedly was like a whale, but in fact it's actually nothing like a whale ear bone. He claimed that the cheekbone is like a whale because it's very thin, but actually when you examine the fossil, it's not thin at all. In fact, it's thicker than a horse's cheekbone. At the end of the day, none of these 8 features are whale-like at all. And there was a certain degree of dishonesty here because some models of the Ambulocetus skull were passed on to museums. And if you look at the snout of the skull, you see a blowhole there. Because, whales have blowholes, so this shows us on the way to being a whale. But the actual fossil has no such blowhole. That's not exactly honest. If we look at these supposed whale ancestors, and this is given to you on PBS, this is given to you in the schools to convince the children that evolution is true. They're asked to describe these fossils. We have the Pakicetus. Okay? Now, Pakicetus, again, same thing. The only evidence they pointed to is that it has the characteristic whale ear. But once again, it's not whale-like. It doesn't even have a sigmoid process. It's plate-like, which means it's typical of land animals. There's nothing about Pakicetus to suggest that it is the ancestor of a whale. The bones in the flippers may be somewhat similar to monkeys, but that doesn't make it a whale. That shows a common designer, because there's no naturalistic mechanism to make such a change anyway. They have another one called the Basilosaurus. It had tiny little hind legs, they say. Evolved tiny little hind legs. And you get a bit of problem there. Because why would a land animal that has normal hind legs, why would it evolve them to shrink, to become tiny? How does that enhance its survival? And when we study the bones of the supposed tiny hind legs, it looks like they're actually reproductive claspers. They're not even legs at all. It was fully aquatic, and the shape of its body and of its teeth rule out it being a whale ancestor. We have a Synonyx is also supposed to be a whale-like ancestor. It's simply a cat-like animal. There's nothing about it. Nothing about it that's whale-like. And here's the thing. Okay? People have no idea. Okay? They say, oh, look, its ear is sort of like a whale. That means it evolved. They have no idea what it would actually take to go from a land animal to a whale. Let me give you a partial list of the changes that would have had to have taken place for this to happen. Okay? And it comes from Dr. Richard Sternberg via Don Batten in an article in Journal of Creation. We have, first, it would need a countercurrent heat exchanger for intra-abdominal testes to keep them cool. The vertebra would have to become ball vertebra, so the tail would move up and down instead of side to side like land animals. You would need to develop tail flukes and musculature. The whale would have to, this land animal would have to develop vast amounts of blubber to insulate, temperature insulation when it's in the ocean. Oh, here's a fun one. It would have to evolve the ability to drink seawater. Land animals drink fresh water. Whales have to drink seawater. It's salty. Okay? Land animals can't drink salt water. If you drink that, you die from it. The whale can because its kidney tissues are very different. So evolution would have to reorganize the kidney tissues. But how long does that take? What does the whale drink for all that time? Don't you think it would perhaps die of thirst while it's waiting for its kidney tissues to reorganize? It would have to change to giving birth with the fetus in the breech position for birth underwater. Again, how does it reproduce while it's waiting for this to happen? Okay? The offspring will keep dying, and that's the end. The DNA doesn't pass on anymore. And if it survived, you'd have to modify the mammae so that it could nurse the young underwater. So until that happens, how do the young eat? Well, they don't. They starve to death. End of story. The forelimbs would have to transform into flippers. The hind limbs would have to shrink. You'd have to reduce or lose the pelvis and sacral vertebrae. You'd have to reorganize the musculature for the reproductive organs. You'd have to change hydrodynamic properties of the skin. You'd need special lung surfactants. You need a novel muscle system for the blowhole. Isn't that fun? Like, how do you breathe until those muscles just happen to evolve? The teeth would have to change. Modification of the eye for underwater vision. Land animals don't see well underwater. So there's your land animal. Oh, I think I want to become a sea animal. He's in the water and he can't give birth properly. His offspring die. He can't feed them. She can't feed them. Freezes because they don't have the blubber yet for insulation. Very, very thirsty because he can't drink the seawater and he can't see where it's going. And it can't see the predators coming at it to eat it. So many things that would have to change. People have no idea. They have no idea. They think, oh yeah, sure. Well, you can change from a land animal to a whale. They have no idea how many things would have to change. And they'd all have to change together. Otherwise, the animal would not survive in the sea. Okay? And when you hear it, then you realize how ridiculous it is. But people don't hear it. And so there are a few animals like this, so-called missing links that they point to. One favorite is the Tiktaalik, which consists of a skull and a fin, and they claim that this is a transitional form between fish and tetrapods. Because they say, you see the Tiktaalik, it uses its fins to walk on land. In fact, the Tiktaalik's fin was not attached to its main skeleton and could not possibly have been used, could not have supported its weight on land. Okay? And the other thing is, you've never actually seen the thing. So how do you know what it uses its fins for? Can we just figure out by looking at the shape of it? Yes, the evolutionists will tell you. No, the facts will tell you. Have you heard of the coelacanth? The coelacanth was a fish that's supposedly prehistoric. It supposedly died out 65 million years ago with the dinosaurs, but we found a number of fossils of the coelacanth. And if you look at the fossils, you see these robust fins on the bottom, and we were told by the evolutionists that the coelacanth used these fins, sort of like feet, to crawl around on the bottom of the sea. And this was a transitional form. These fins were on their way to becoming legs as they're moving from fish to tetrapod. That's an animal that walks on 4 legs. And they told us, it's a fact. I mean, you can look at the fossil, you can tell exactly what it did with those fins. And then the whole story collapsed in 1938 when fishermen fishing off the coast of South Africa actually hauled in a live coelacanth. Turned out it didn't die out 65 million years ago. And they found entire populations of them still alive, many of them off of Indonesia. So now we don't have to guess what they did with their fins from the fossils. We look at what they do. We can see them. And you know what? They use their fins like any other fish to propel themselves through the water. They do not walk on the bottom with these fins. You should remember that the next time evolutionists tell you, oh yeah, we can look at the fossils and we can tell you for sure this is what it did and therefore it's a transitional form. No, they can't. They make stuff up. With the Tiktaalik, even they have to give up on it because they eventually found tetrapod tracks, what they believe are tetrapods, from millions of years before the Tiktaalik. Okay? Well, just like you can't be older than your grandmother, if tetrapods were already around at the time of Tiktaalik and before Tiktaalik, then the Tiktaalik cannot be their ancestor, can it? Ooh, but they love to say things that just sound so impressive because ordinary people can't understand it. You will read something like this. Although the size and general robusticity of the pelvis is derived relative to other finned forms, aspects of the general architecture of the girdle are plesiomorphic. Antecedents of canonical tetrapod pelvic characteristics are seen in Tiktaalik. Although Tiktaalik lacks a sacral rib connecting the pelvic girdle with the vertebral column, the iliac blade is relatively more massive and dorsally expanded than in fish. Any idea what that means?
I have no idea what that means.
No idea. You know, people have no idea what that means, and I said, wow, that sounds good. It's got to be a transitional form, because who can argue with that? Let me translate that into ordinary human speech. And this is what it comes down to. Tiktaalik's pelvis may be as large as a tetrapod pelvis, but in fact it looks like a fish pelvis, and without the rib connecting it to the backbone, the pelvis and its fins cannot bear weight on land. So it works like a fish pelvis. Thus the pelvis is obviously simply that of a fish. So Tiktaalik is a fish. It's not an ancestral form, never was. But this is how desperate they are to have them to promote evolution, that they keep trying to tell you that we have them when they really don't. But now of all fossils, okay, the most fun ones, the ones where you get the most claims of ancestors, is of course the hominids. All these human ancestors. We have all these bones and skulls and body parts of human ancestors. So we know that human beings evolved from ape-like creatures. Now, modern apes, they like to say, oh, see, you say humans evolved from apes, and so you don't know what you're talking about. We didn't evolve from apes, which is not strictly true. I mean, nobody thinks we evolved from modern apes like gorillas and orangutans. But they'll say, okay, so what did we evolve from? Oh, Australopithecus. What kind of animal was that? It was an ape. So we did evolve from apes. Yeah. That's the claim. This is from Time magazine, 1994. Cover article showing a Homo erectus, and the headline, How Man Began. Fossil bones from the dawn of humanity are rewriting the story of evolution. 1994, this is according to Time magazine. And they're telling you, everything we told you about human evolution before, it was wrong. Here's the new version. Believe this. Now, the funny thing is every 2 or 3 years you get an article just like that. Time to rewrite the story of human evolution. It doesn't end. Here's New Scientist magazine, which I just bought off the newsstand this week. And on the front we have Rewriting Our Story. New bones throw human origins into doubt. Again. If I had $1 for every time they've switched up their story, I'd be a rich man by now. It makes me wonder, do we not learn from the story of the boy who cried wolf? How often can they tell us, you got to believe this. This is fact. This is science. This is proven. Only to have them say, we were actually wrong about all that. Here's the new version. You should believe this. And then we believe that for another year or two until they have yet another. And no, we were wrong about everything we told you before. This is the way it is now. And you have to ask yourself, the old saying, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. How many times are we going to get fooled by this? Let's look at the story then of human ancestors, the hominids. Okay? Pick up National Geographic, turn on PBS, you will see pictures of scientists holding a skull. And they're going to tell you this is a human ancestor. And how do you argue with that? I mean, he's holding it and he's telling you it's a human ancestor. You might look at it, you see these black patches and you find out those are parts we haven't found actually. So basically we've taken a bunch of little bone shards and stuck them onto a model that we built. And many, many years ago when I was grade 11, we went to the Royal Ontario Museum on a field trip, and they were taking us through the evolution gallery, and we're all supposed to believe in evolution, and they were showing us the hominid skulls. Now, these were copies, of course. The Royal Ontario Museum does not have any of the original ones. Very few museums do. And I was looking at them, and I saw look so perfect skull, and I noticed a few black spots on the skull here and there. And as the class was moving on to the next display, I asked the tour guide, what are those black, it's not black spots, white spots. What are those white spots there? And he looked at me and said, well, those are the parts we've actually found. Oi? It's like, there's this nice skull with a few little white spots, but the white spots are the parts that we've actually found, which means the rest is just imagination. And that's what comes when somebody shows you, honestly, when somebody shows you a hominid skull, which is missing a great deal of parts, and they tell you this is a human ancestor, how do you know? How can you possibly know that this is a human ancestor? What do you think?
I mean, there's so many missing pieces that scientists still haven't found, so I don't know if you can know.
Yeah, even if we give them benefit down, say they find all the missing pieces put together, and it does look like that. How do you know that that's a human ancestor? Oh, you can't. They just tell you it is. Yeah. Well, they do try to point to some features that they would say this is signs of, they would say bipedalism. Humans walk on 2 legs, unlike the apes that generally walk on 4 legs. They're quadrupeds. And if you walk on 2 legs, that's a sign that you're actually a human ancestor. Like, for example, the ostrich, which walks on 2 legs, or the penguin, which also walks on 2 legs. Oh, it's not, humans aren't the only ones that walk on 2 legs, but that's birds. You see, that's birds. So, ignore the birds. So, okay, basilisk, frilled lizards. Okay, yep, they're lizards that walk on 2 legs. So, mammals. Okay, among mammals, only humans walk on 2 legs, right? Only humans. You can't think of, kangaroos, right? They're bipedal, I guess. Among primates, and yet there are some primates that seem to walk bipedal. There's an interesting black monkey that they called Natasha in a safari park in Israel. It got sick and recovered. It was walking on 2 legs after that. So even if you could tell that the skull belonged to someone that was bipedal, if you could tell, and it's very much a question whether you can or not, but if you could, it wouldn't prove that it's a human ancestor. So the other thing they will look at then is cranial capacity. And cranial capacity is how big is your skull? What's the volume of your skull? How much does it hold? Because that essentially determines the size of your brain. And they'll say if you look at like monkeys, their cranial capacity can hold maybe 100 grams of brain, and orangutan maybe 400 grams, and chimpanzee. But a human, look at the size of his cranial capacity, can hold 1,350 grams. It's 1,350 cubic centimeters in size. And they would say, well, look at these human ancestors and look at this lovely pattern of cranial capacity. You got your chimpanzees around 400, your gorilla around 500. Your modern man, they put him at 1,450 here. But look at the human ancestors. The Australopithecus, he's right about the size of a gorilla. 494 cubic centimeters. You move up to Homo habilis, and he's at 656. And you got the Homo erectus, 935. Cro-Magnon man, 1,370. And you get modern man, 1,450. Look at that perfect pattern. Look at how that cranial capacity is just increasing as you're moving from ape to human. Do you see, is there one missing here? Is there a human ancestor you've heard of that's not on that list?
What about the Neanderthal?
Neanderthal man, that's interesting. Why did they leave him off the list? Well, because Neanderthal man, his cranial capacity was 1,650. Bigger than Cro-Magnon man, bigger than modern man. Ooh, he breaks the pattern, so let's just leave him off. And here's another big issue. You're big, and this one as an engineer, you'll particularly appreciate. How many specimens would you need of the skull of a particular type of creature to draw statistically significant conclusions about the size of the cranial capacity?
Yeah, obviously the more you have, the better. I mean, for example, if you only had one skull, it could have been the skull of an adult, could have been the skull of a little baby. So, yeah, you need lots.
Yeah, you need lots. If for scientific experiments, scientific research, they generally say like a minimum of 400 to give yourself your 95% confidence level. Anything less than 100, they say, is garbage. How many specimens did we have to establish these? Your Australopithecus afarensis, 4. Australopithecus africanus, 7. Paranthropus boisei, 1. Paranthropus robustus, 1. Homo habilis, 6. Homo rudolfensis, 1. Homo ergaster, 3. Is that, could those numbers possibly be valid when you have so few specimens? No. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I like to show this picture to my classes. It has a fellow named Bao Xishun, who at the time was the tallest man on Earth. He's actually the second tallest now. 7 foot 8.95 inches in height. Beside him was He Pingping, second shortest man on the planet. He was 2 foot 5 inches. Now, they're both fully functional, intellectually normal people. Mm-hmm. But look at the difference in cranial capacity between these two. How would they compare?
Bao's would obviously be a lot bigger.
Yeah, you could possibly fit He Pingping's entire body into Bao Xishun's cranium. Maybe not quite. But the point is, if these evolutionists found the skull of He Pingping after he died and of Bao Xishun, they would swear to you that there are millions of years of evolution separating these two. And we have Sultan Kosan, who is now the world's tallest man. He's taller than Bao Xishun. He's 8 foot 1 inches. So here you go. This is the problem. Cranial capacity, first, they don't have enough specimens to draw an average. And second, average doesn't tell you much because you have such a huge range in the human population among intellectually normal people. So it's the range you need to look at. So the range for human beings is just huge. So you have no really good way to take a skull and say, this is a human ancestor. It's done because the ideology says we evolved from ape-like creatures. Okay? And they need to find the evidence for that. And through the years, they've put forth many, many putative human ancestors, from Neanderthal man through Java man, Piltdown man, Peking man, Nebraska man, Australopithecus, Ramapithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Ramidus. I call it Ramidus because it was originally Australopithecus ramidus and they magically turned into Ardipithecus ramidus. But we'll look at that later. But of all of these, every single one of them is either fully an ape or fully a man or an outright fraud. There is no other. There are no human ancestors. If we look back at cranial capacity, the fellow called Villi in his book Biology, modern man has a brain volume of about 1,500 cubic centimeters, while the higher apes have a brain size of only 600. Richard Milner, in his Encyclopedia of Evolution, says living humans have a cranial capacity ranging from about 950 to 1,800. That's very different from 1,500. If we can have normal living humans with only 950. The lowest on record for a normal man, 790. The lowest for one who had mental complications, 511. Less than the higher apes. And yet this was a human. Meanwhile, the largest Homo erectus brains were about 1,250. So exactly in the range for modern humans. Some Homo erectus skulls contain larger brains. The Vertesöllös man found in Hungary supposedly dated to 350 to 400,000 BC, is estimated to have a cranial capacity of approximately 1,400 cubic centimeters, which is what our evolutionists tell us is normal for modern man. So there are problems with identifying any piece of skull that we find as being a hominid ancestor. And there are a lot more problems with these supposed human ancestors.
Hello everyone. Due to the massive amount of content for this series on evolution, we have broken it down into 3 different parts. The next part will be part 2 and will continue for a few hours, and we hope you continue to listen and enjoy the series.
Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. If you like our content, please share this information with family and friends. It helps us a lot. We also would love to hear from you. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by searching Truth in My Days as one word again. Truth in My Days as one word. No spaces in between. Or reach us by email at info@truthinmydays.com. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.